This is the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, a discussion of the 2017 Eisner Award nominations.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics for young readers.
On this episode of the Comics Alternative's Young Readers Show, we'll be reviewing all of the nominees for the three Young Readers categories for the 2017 Eisner Awards. This is like
Gwen.
It's like the Oscars, right? Woohoo!
That's right. It's a big time of year for us, for comics. And that means that we're going to be talking about the 5 books that were nominated for Best Publication for Early Readers, which is up to age 8, as well as the 5 books nominated for Best Publication for Kids, ages 9 to 12, and the 6 titles nominated for Best Publication for Teens, ages 13 to 17. So we got quite a lot on the docket today, Gwen.
Right. Before we start today's show, I want to remind everybody that our program is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Head over to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. Every week, DCBS has DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off, and many other publishers' comics regularly run between 20 and 35% off the list price. In fact, DCBS has specials that run 45 to 50% off the cover price, and often the discounts are more impressive than that. So head over to dcbservice.com or their sister site, In Stock Trades, for all of your comics ordering needs.
While you're there, you're going to be able to see that for this month, for June, Discount Comic Book Service has a Marvel Kids bundle that includes Marvel Universe Avengers Ultron Revolution, which is all the way up to number 12, Woo! And Marvel Universe Guardians of the Galaxy, which is all the way up to number 21, and you get those together in a bundle for only $2.98, 50% off the cover price. DCBS also has a DC Kids bundle that has Scooby-Doo Where Are You number 84, Scooby-Doo Team Up number 29, and Teen Titans Go number 23, at $4.47, which is 50% off the cover price for those titles. And you're going to find those and lots of other great deals and discounts that are available on comics and bundles, all at Discount Comic Book Service.
That is right, Paul. And when you do order from dcbservice.com, be sure to tell them that Paul and Gwen sent you.
Yep, let them know.
Paul, it's been a tradition each year that the Young Readers Show reviews the Eisner-nominated titles for the Young Readers category. I mean, this is, I think, our second year of doing it, but it's a tradition. And
that makes it a tradition.
It does. And for folks who maybe aren't entirely familiar with the Eisners, we thought we'd just give you an understanding of how these books are selected in the first place. So basically, in January, publishers are invited to put forward 5 books in each category, and there are multiple categories beyond the young adult category. So it's for things like best penciler, best artist, best series, that sort of thing. And so the publishers can put forward 5 entries, and then people who are self-published or who feel that their publisher maybe neglected their title are also able to put forward their books. So there's a relatively large pool every year of texts that then get culled down to a short list of nominees. And those are really the texts that we're going to be talking about today. And essentially what happens is that list was released in early May, and then the Eisner Awards will be handed out at the San Diego Comic-Con on Friday, July 21st. So before we even get going, just want to say a big congratulations to everyone who was nominated. Yeah. I know for some comics creators, it's comics writing, drawing comics. It's not not everybody's making Raina Telgemeier's $10 million a year. Well, I don't know what she's making, but that's what she's grossing. Right. And so for some comics creators, this will be the first time that they would even get to go to Comic-Con. So for some of them, it's really an amazing opportunity beyond just the honor of being nominated. But so this will happen in July. So, what Paul and I really want to do today is to talk a little bit about those categories and what they tell us about the state of comics.
Yeah. I mean, I think I love the Eisner nominees list because it puts a spotlight on so many different kinds of comics. And I think it's just a bellwether, kind of a way of, a measuring stick for where the industry is oftentimes. And having these 3 different categories for, the young reader's realm where, Gwen, you and I, and in the past, you and Andy Wolverton have covered, it's just another opportunity, I think, to think about the field as well as to put the spotlight on different works, which is what we want to do today. And so we want to, definitely congratulate creators and publishers who were nominated. And also we want to express our thank you to the publishers and creators who sent us review copies of many of the titles that we're reviewing today. And some of these titles you and Andy Wolverton have reviewed on the Comics Alternative Young Readers episodes back in 2016 when these came out. And, I think you and I both saw the nominees list and we're pretty delighted that there were a lot of things that we cherished. And so definitely well-deserved, these nominations. And so I'm really excited to talk about these with you. So, I guess to start us off, what we want to do is walk through portion by, category by category, and we'll talk about each category as a whole, some thoughts on the category overall, and then we're going to go into each title and we'll take it just as the nominees were announced. And so we'll start off, Gwen, with the best publication for early readers, up to age 8. And we have 5 titles in here. And I got to admit that this category, included the titles that I had the least familiarity with going into this discussion. Even though my daughter, as I mentioned many times on this podcast, she's 6. She and I read comics together a lot, but we tend to read comics, I noticed, that are a little bit more in the next category. But in the time since finding out about, these, nominees, we spent a lot of time with these books, and we're thoroughly entertained and delighted by them. So, just, I feel like I should get an envelope here and open it to announce the nominees. But, we have Ape and Armadillo Take Over the World by James Sturm from Toon Books. We have Bert's Way Home by John Martz from Koyama Press. We have The Creeps Book 2, The Trolls Will Feast by Chris Schweizer from Abrams. We have I'm Grumpy, part of the My First Comics series, by Jennifer L. Holm and Matthew Holm from Random House Books for young readers. And we have Narwhal, Unicorn of the Sea by Ben Clanton from Tundra. And so, Gwen, I wondered if you had some thoughts about the category overall to start us off with.
Yeah, well, I will say that this is a category, too, like you, I didn't have as much familiarity with up front, but it's always an interesting process to read all these books at once then, because I had read Narwhal because I love narwhals. They're cute. But the others I hadn't read, and reading them all at once, one of the things I see is that there's a lot of emphasis here on friendship. And on how to make a friend, how to keep a friend, the things that can come between friends. And so that's a theme that I see working throughout these texts. And this category, for me, really challenges what we mean when we use the word comics in relation to young readers.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, one of the titles is a board book, essentially. The I'm Grumpy is a board book, and it really feels much more to me like a board book than a comic. And maybe we can get into that a little bit more when we talk about it individually. But from a thematic standpoint, this is not an atypical subject. If you look at the larger realm of children's literature, so many texts focus on these sort of interpersonal relationships among young people. So there wasn't any real major outlier or shock for me. I will say that The Creeps Book 2, one of the things that is doing is it's showing us that as this category matures, we have a number of series being nominated that are into their 2nd or 3rd volume.
Yes.
And that's something new for children's comics because typically, even if you look at last year, almost everything that was nominated that was part of a series was the first book in that series. So it's interesting that we're now getting into the situation where we maybe have 2nd or 3rd books of collected comics in a series.
That's right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that what you brought up, that this category has, contains a spectrum. It's certainly all stuff that's for early or emerging readers, but you really get to see how broad a range that is. We're talking about, like you said, I'm Grumpy, which is very much a board book type of book, to something like The Creeps, which seems to aim towards the upper end of that 0 to 8-year-old range. And so I think it's really interesting that the category, one of the things that it brings up for me is that, the categorical distinctions between these and picture books is hard, and it kind of pushes on our definitions, like you were saying, of what makes comics, what makes it comics, as opposed to, an illustrated children's book. Is it having sequences and panels, or is it having text that's embedded in the images? How does somebody like Mo Willems and the Elephant and Piggy books kind of get left out or included in a category like this? And so it kind of speaks to how I think the tools of comics offer different kinds of, their own, ways of being read, their own semiotic systems, if you want to get academic about it. But it's also just kind of tied up to the tools that we use for young kids in their early literacy. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the range of books we have here.
Yeah, and comics as a category for young readers it differs from sort of text-only narratives in that with most text-only narratives, they're produced by mainstream publishers who have a 40 or 50-year history, even longer in some instances, of age designations for readers. And one of the reasons why this gets important as we move through the categories is when you start to get into the YA category especially, you start to look at challenges that are often brought against visual texts and comics. And just one thing for our readers to know is that the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund has a wonderful set of resources for educators, librarians, and parents that focuses on how to designate comics by age if they haven't been pre-designated, which is something that librarians don't have to think about with most texts coming out of mainstream publishers that are text only.
That's right, yeah.
And so, I really want to be careful here because I think both of us, Paul, at one point or another, have talked about the problematic nature of age designation. I mean, you've alluded to it in a way today when you talk about the texts that you sit and read with your daughter that are probably out of her age designation. And I really have a lot of issues with age designation, but that said, that's because I have the luxury of being a university professor, right? I'm not, I'm not in a situation where I'm either trying to convince a school board that a book should be taught in a certain class or that I'm trying to figure out where to put a book on a shelf so that, it really is appropriately shelved for most people in a community. And so, that's something to think about, too. I'm sure that the judges and the folks who run the Eisners are up against that, too. So a book like The Creeps maybe gets pushed up into the early readers category out of the middle grade reader because maybe there were just so many texts in that category. Right. And you can make the justification that it could belong in either. So let's push it into a category that maybe wasn't as strong this year or didn't have as many entrants. Maybe that's part of the thinking. Yeah.
And, among the factors you have to weigh and consider is the reading level or literacy level. Although as a literacy researcher, I think that's a very fuzzy category as well. What makes something readable for a kid at a certain, proficiency of reading, but also there's content questions, whether the content will be over a kid's head or contains things that might be a little too scary or dark or subject matters that would be hard for a kid to digest. Although on that note, I really enjoyed about this category that several of the titles kind of, they kind of buck the sweetness factor that books, often written for this age can get mired in, like there's kind of an early reader syrup that can make things, drag a little bit. But, you think about Ape and Armadillo and they kind of have this like Despicable Me type of funny kind of villainy going on, and even up to The Creeps and the kind of, great kind of weirdness of those kids and the kind of kids brand of horror. And it's just, so there's just like a range that I really enjoy, in the content that, I'm kind of excited that this is, I'm excited to march this out as a bunch of exemplars of what great, early reader comics do.
And maybe we should just jump in. And I do want to tell our readers, normally Paul and I will talk about maybe 2 comics tops. And so there's not going to be a lot of rustling when we do that, because for me, I often have them. I read I use the digital comics for when we're doing our show, so I can scroll through quietly. But today we've got 15 books, most of them hardcover. Right. And there is just no way that we're going to be able to be super silent.
That's right. So, we got piles here, right?
We do. So Paul, do we want to start off with Ape and Armadillo Take Over the World by Jim Sturm? And again, this is out of Toon Books.
Yep.
That's the Spiegelman's wonderful publishing house that focuses on books for young and emerging readers.
Yeah.
So, Paul, what did you think of Ape and Armadillo Take Over the World?
Yeah, I loved it. Well, first off, I want to thank Toon Books for a review copy. And, under the editorial guidance of, as you said, the Spiegelmans, Francois Mouly. This is now 10 years of Toon Books. Can you believe it? And, they've been consistently making comics that are, I think, kind of defining for a generation how really young kids encounter comics. And cartoonists, of which Sturm is certainly one. He's a founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies, and he's done works like Satchel Paige and Ogres Awake. And so I love this title. Armadillo and Ape are arguing with each other about why Ape has to do the dirty work in their nefarious plots to take over the world, and like stealing the Wizard King's wand and stuff like that. And so you really have 2 characters who, have a bad intent, but it's certainly not scary. Their arguments turn out to be discussions of fairness and whether or not we do, in fact, want to blow up the world. And I think it ends on really the sweetest note that you can imagine for a couple of pals. One of the things I really enjoyed about Ape and Armadillo Take Over the World is that there's kind of the feature on the bottom of the page, the top, maybe 3/5 or really 4/5 of the page is the main story, but it does that thing that a lot of early comic strips like Mutt and Jeff did, these tiny mini gags at the bottom. For instance, one in brief, ninja or Viking, and Ape declares, Viking ninja. Split the difference. And
do you know what I think is really weird? That's the page I turn to.
That's funny. There's something
to
about
talk about this. That is
Viking ninjas calling out to us. So there's it's just a great example of the humorous tone, and this kind of playful character development. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and actually my daughter also had great fun reading this as well.
When you read it with her, how did she use the gag comics that go along the bottom?
Actually, she read it on her own in the back of the car while I was driving her, as we are often in the situation of. And she actually pointed out to me, she said, "Oh, this is a lot like Squirrel Girl," which we'll talk about later on, because Squirrel Girl has just a text gag at the tiny, in tiny print at the bottom of the page. Mm-hmm. And that was the connection she made, the idea of like a parallel running joke. And so she commented on that and just, found it funny. But I think what she ended up doing is deciding that I'm just going to read the main story at the top and come back and enjoy these little bits later on separately.
Right. Yeah. Well, I loved it. And I thought when we talk about reading and the way that, in some ways, good comics reading involves slowing down and taking time. And this particular structure, I think, actually encourages it. It's not a distraction as much as it is. I think it really does, because many of the questions that are being asked along the bottom and the little gags that come out of them are actually relevant to the comic that is happening in the main portion of the narrative. Huh. So it also gives sort of an added commentary on that. So I think it's a really rich text, and it's visually beautiful. The line style is pretty close to clear line, and it has a little Hergé color scheme feel, even a lot of the same sort of soft yellows, greens, grays, reds that I associate with Hergé, and so it's really a beautiful comic to look at as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the fun of the illustrations is that there is the Ape and Armadillo, and a really focus on these 2 characters. Armadillo's kind of like a little bit hunched over, almost mad scientist type, and Ape is kind of his goon-like friend, but in the conversation between them and the sort of expressiveness of their bodies and their speech, there's a lot of I think subverting that stereotype relationship of the brains and the brawn of an evil duo. And it's very sweet. But also, as part of them talking about these different scenarios that they're thinking about for taking over the world, you get these little, visual and imaginative, little, flights of fancy, I guess, whether it's like, ape in a sewer or under a castle, or there's robots or Pegasuses and things like that. So there's also a little bit of space for kind of visual, imagination.
Well, it was a beautiful book, and maybe the storyline is takes a sort of, I think, page out of the little action adventure imagination texts that are so popular for young readers, because a lot of this too is their evil, nefarious schemes that they go on are actually, it's clear that they're kids who are imagining these things.
Sure, right.
And so it's really sweet to sort of see how imagination plays out. And this is the first of many, many texts that we'll be looking at today that focus on that in some way.
Yeah. In fact, our next one too. Gwen, you want to take us there to Bert's Way Home? Touches on that a little bit.
Absolutely. Bert's Way Home is probably one of my favorite comics of 2016. It's by John Martz. It's out of Koyama Press. It is a beautiful sort of meditation on being lost, trying to find one's way home. And, unlike many of the entries for kids in general in this category overall. This is a comic that has a lot of indeterminacy built right into it. There isn't an easy resolution. And so, readers are confronted initially with a sort of interesting story of space travel. There's a character, Bert, and he sort of looks like a duck human. Yeah. Does that seem like a pretty fair?
Yeah.
And Linda, who is a middle-aged woman who is appears temporary caregiver, looks like a dog.
Right.
But like like me, sort of with dog ears, really, to be quite honest. That's great. If you look at the images for this, you'll be like, okay, Gwen, that's pretty good. It's pretty straight on. And I mean, right at the very beginning of the text, the narrative is destabilized because in one panel you have Linda sitting there knitting in a sort of warm domestic space, and it almost actually reminds me of a little bit of a nod to Goodnight Moon. I'll just say, but the narration reads, "Linda isn't my mom." And then there's a picture of Bert looking into a mirror, and the narrator, Bert, says, "My name isn't even Bert. No one must know the secret of my true identity. I'm an intergalactic trans-dimensional time traveler. I'm trapped here on Earth a long way from home." And that's how this text begins. And if you wish to take it literally, Bert is a traveler who tries a lot of different ways to try to get back home. But if you look at it more as a metaphor, it's a really poignant story of a young person who is separated from his family and who loves his caretaker, but who has still a deep longing to understand fully where he belongs. It's a comic that's done primarily in 3 colors, black, white, and a very soft shade of blue. For the most part, there are some other panels that take on a slightly different color, but that's the major sort of color palette for the comic. And to me, of all the comics that we're going to look at today, it has, in my opinion, the most connection to French comics. To me, this is a truly Franco-Belgian type text, both in its look and line style, but also in the indeterminacy of sort of the quote-unquote ending of the story. There's a lot of questions that are left unanswered, and that kind of ambiguity, I think, is a really lends a richness to it. So, among other things, in addition to hearing what you think about it, I'd love to hear what your daughter thought about it. Based on that, this is so exciting to have a young person that we can reference.
Yeah. One day maybe we can have her on the podcast, because she loves talking about comics.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I did also really love Bert's Way Home. There's few of these books that we'll talk about today where I can't say that about, but I think it had I had a kind of special affection for this, partly because the dog sort of, or mouse. I'm not sure what it is, but I thought it was really funny that you said it sort of looks like a version of you. I think Bert might look a little bit like me. Maybe we should take the two of them together as our logo for the podcast. But,
I think we should ask John Martz to do our logo.
Exactly.
That'd be awesome.
Just draw these two characters, but
because you really, dude, you're almost there.
Right. You don't have to do much to it. But I think that their relationship, as you were saying, actually exactly because of that, indeterminacy, where you're not sure if Bert is an imaginative kid who thinks he's a time traveler, and Lydia is the mother who allows him, mother figure, I should say, who, just gives him the rope to just go and be as imaginative as he is, or if in fact he actually is a transdimensional time traveler, and still the relationship is really sweet. And I love that really from the beginning you have, and just thinking about this as a reading experience for kids, you have two narrators, and, the typeset kind of distinguishes whose voice we're hearing, but you really kind of get the perspective of, and I think it's Lydia, the mother, who is, just really earnestly, she says on page 12, I hope he's happy here, that his happiness is her greatest wish, and says things like, I only wish he would wear a hat when he goes out, in the cold night air. And, Bert is searching around for, the tools he needs to make his, escape, and she's experiencing that. These things go missing around the house. And, it's light and it's fun, but I gotta be honest, I got to the end of it and I got a little teary-eyed, at the thought of particularly Lydia just loving this kid in this way of just accepting, whether it is a scientific reality or not, what he's going after, what he's going about doing. It just kind of is a picture of, unconditional love and support that is kind of an ideal of, surrogate parenthood or whatever.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because the interspecies thing never really comes up.
Yeah.
The way that they're sized
right.
doesn't actually make sense, because if Lydia is a mouse or even a small dog, I think you're right. If you look at the pictures on the wall, everyone really looks like a mouse.
Oh, there you go.
Maybe
That's
it's
true.
just because I'm missing my dog. I don't know my late dog, but but everything becomes a dog now to me. But the point is that even their sizes are, there's just a lot of playfulness here. But underneath it, one of the things that I think that Martz does really, really well is to create not only a believable child character, but a child who's experiencing a lot of distress, but he does it in a way that isn't maudlin.
Right.
And as you say, there's no syrupiness to it either, although towards the end, I was really... I hate to admit how much, I advocate indeterminate endings. I think they're really important. I think it respects the child reader to present them with an ending that isn't tied up neatly. Yeah. But yet this was one text where I would have liked there to be some resolution. And in a way, I mean, we know that Bert is loved and that Lydia loves Bert, but it's just one of those books where, like you said, it was a beautiful book, dreamy, experimental, interesting. Really loved it.
Agree. Totally agree. Yeah. So a thumbs up on Bert's Way Home. Are you ready, Gwen, for us to move into the creeps?
Oh, let's go, Paul. Lay it on the line. Tell us what we need to know about the trolls who want to feast.
Well, this is actually, as we said, the second book in a series that Abrams has put out, and Chris Schweizer, who is the creator of Krogan's Adventures and also has done a lot of interesting kind of historical comics and also Adventure Time stuff, this is now the second in the series about these four kids. There's Carol, who's a hacker extraordinaire, and Mitchell, the monster expert, Jarvis, the gadget whiz, and Rosario, the super ripped fashionista. I love those little descriptions. And I want to thank Amulet Books, and Abrams for the review copies of this book. I actually had bought the first volume of The Creeps, which is subtitled Night of the Frankenfrogs. And I have to admit, I wasn't nearly as taken with that one as I was with this second adventure. And I don't know if it's because this one just seemed actually really topical and smart to me in terms of things that kids, are starting to confront at this age. And definitely by the time they're teenagers is quite full blown. But basically, I describe the Creeps as basically a really kid friendly version of a very, very mildly scary, mostly not scary. It's more like horror tropes, but showing up as like kind of fun monster adventures. But what it does have that, a lot of really good, scary stories or horror has is actually, heroes or protagonists who have this slightly offbeat, a little bit, weirdo kind of, designation. And they have to confront trolls, and in this case, actual monster trolls who go after those who are stressed out by the activity in their town of an online gossip site, which obviously is a little nod towards the other kind of trolls that is very much a part of kids' reality these days. And so, I don't know. What did you think about the Creeps, Gwen?
Well, I really liked it. I found it to be visually pretty complicated for this category.
Yes,
and that's why I really do believe that probably for our parents who are listening at home, if you're in doubt, definitely preview the book first, look through a little bit of it yourself to figure that out. Because, the fact that the next book we're going to be talking about is a board book really underscores the range of sophistication that we're looking at in this category. I liked this text. The reservations I have about it are simply that it's dealing with monsters in a relatively traditional way. And I would compare that to at least two texts that did not make the cut this year in the Eisners that I think actually deal with monsters in a more sophisticated and interesting way. That would be Bera, the One-Headed Troll by Eric Orchard, and also the book by Drew Weinig from the Creepy Case Files of Margot Malou. Drew has been doing that comic online for a couple years, and it just got published this year by First Second in the first volume in paper. And it deals with issues of monsters and monstrous behavior in ways that humanize the monsters in a really non-traditional and fascinating manner. So this isn't, I want to back up, but I do want to say I really enjoyed the Creeps. I thought it was entertaining. I thought it was funny. I could definitely see how kids would like it. I feel like it's one of many books right now that are dealing with a group of kids who, it's sort of like along the Scooby-Doo formula, right? Who have to solve things. Now, that said, there are ways in which I thought this book was, as you said, very topical and interesting. One of them is kids are dealing with authority figures here and trying to advocate for things that they see going on, and they get rebuffed a lot. And that's something that they overcome. And I do think that is a really valuable aspect of this text.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, Gwen, I'm still reeling in shock a little bit because I just realized that Wang and Orchard's books, Margot Malou and Bera were this past year. And I'm just realizing that they are, to me, massive exclusions or maybe oversights on these lists. Is that accurate?
I feel that they are, but again, I don't want to take it out on Chris Schweizer, whose book is wonderful. I was actually going to leave it for the middle grade category to sort of really unleash my sense of like that this is wrong. Let's come back to that because it's really interesting too because just one of the things we haven't yet mentioned really is the size of these texts. I really love the size of Creeps. It's a great comic for a kid to. It's very kid-friendly hand-wise, and you can, I have very small hands, so I can absolutely be a tester for child gloves or anything else, child use of anything. And, I have abnormally small hands. Donald Trump would be, feeling really great about his hands at this moment next to mine. But it's one where I can hold it in one hand and maybe eat a candy bar or something in the other. But there's a lot of pleasure to holding the text and reading through it. It is a text that does require a certain amount of focus from a young reader, but the characters are funny. And I'm looking over here on page 72 and the kids have found the monsters again, and
right.
And the monster says, "It's you kids again,"
right.
and that to me is just such a great echo of you meddling kids,
right.
And so. And also, we really haven't mentioned this yet, but this is a very diverse group of kids. Yep. And so there's a way in which this text, I think, is breaking ground in important ways. And I think there are ways that we can differentiate it from sort of, your standard Scooby-Doo fare. This book is really dealing with some interesting issues. And again, of kids trying to be heard and taken seriously about things that matter to them. And so in that respect, and Paul, I do have to kind of agree with you. I think the second book is much stronger, and that's exciting because when you're dealing with a book series, sometimes the first one is just stunning and then the second one falls a little flat.
Right.
I don't feel that's the case here at all.
Right.
I feel that this is a much more cohesive, thematically interesting text, and I would definitely recommend it for young readers. And I love the color in it.
Yes.
There's a really effective use of color, even of narration and color. So some of the, in some of the, flashbacks and things like that, color is used to help guide a reader to understand that either an embedded narrative is being put in here or we're referring to something in the past or whatever. And so it's from a technical standpoint, it has a lot of things going for it, especially for young readers who are just really getting into comics and can pick up on those differences and use them and as they do their interpretation of what they're reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of the color, Schweizer, in addition to being a cartoonist, in every sense in this book, is also coloring this book for Image right now called Rock Candy Mountain. And what's interesting about the colors on that book is the contrast between that and this. I think in that book, it's great colors, but it also, each sort of page or scene tends to stay along the same part of the color wheel, while this one has, I think, a lot of complementary colors done in a way that really makes the storytelling very apparent and visible, legible to kids. And I think and it is a lot of fun. And what you mentioned at the top about the sort of form factor or the production size of the book is something that I want to, I'll bring up again with other titles on our list here. But yeah, I guess, I think the art is so rich and thick that part of me wanted to see this bigger, but you're exactly right that it's the ability to hold something like this in your hand for a kid reader is a big part of its accessibility, I think. And, to be able to read and move at a pace, I guess, to flip pages at a pace that feels a little bit like a novel because of how quickly the story moves and makes you want to move. I think the art deserves like a large print so that you can take it all in with your eyes, but I think the story wants to feel compact and fast moving. And that's, I think, a credit to Schweizer's storytelling.
Yeah, and I also have to remind myself, I really didn't, I hate to say this, but I didn't need glasses until I turned over 50. And I'm at a point now where I really need them, and I resent that because it makes books like that harder for me to read. So I have to keep reminding myself, okay, when I was 10, this would have been not a deal to me. Right. It is now. And I felt that way, though, about a couple of the YA comics, too. Yeah. So we can get to that later, but it was like, it's very compact, but I found it really pretty easy to follow, and actually probably easier to follow than Hilda, which we'll talk about in the next category. Even though that text is like about four or five times the size of Creeps. But it's a great one to like take on vacation this summer, pop it into your little backpack or something, and you're good to go. So.
I agree. And actually, I mean, we're talking about up to age 8. You could even have kids slightly older, I think, who would be, have a good time with this one.
Well, I guess we might want to move on to our next title. Maybe the theme of my life right now. It's called I'm Grumpy. Right. And it's by the very accomplished Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm, who have collaborated in the past for, among other things, the Baby Mouse children's series. It's so phenomenally popular. But then Jennifer Holm has a separate career as a writer of text-only children's fiction. Yep. So she has a lot of experience writing for young people. I'm Grumpy is part of a series that Random House is now putting out, I think probably a little bit along the lines of Toon Comics, and it's called My First Comics.
Right.
And on the back it says panels, word balloons, sound effects. And so the idea is that this is a book that's going to help young readers begin to truly understand how comics work. I think that is a wonderful, wonderful philosophy, but I really do want to explain that this is a board book. It is literally a board book. It has the big, thick pages. It's small. I'm tempted to chew on it just because I know that's what happens to board books. And I haven't had lunch yet, so I don't know. But anyway, it really is a board book, and so I think that it's meant to get at kids who are. I mean, with Toon, they have this idea of there are 3 levels of young reader, and they're going to, like, level 1 is probably a little bit more sophisticated than what this book is. So I think this really is meant for actually not readers at all, but kids who probably could not read the phrase "My First Comics" but could chew it. And it's the story of a Cloud who is grumpy, not only because some things have happened in Grumpy's day that are not pleasant, and that includes losing some ice cream, out of a cone, which is a very sad occurrence. If it has happened to you, you know what I mean. But the Cloud runs into Sunshine, and, as stereotypes will go, Sunshine is super happy. And if you're in a grumpy mood and you meet someone who's in a super great mood, sometimes there can be a clash. And it's this way, it's almost a little bit like Ape and Armadillo. It has that same kind of feel. And essentially what Cloud has to learn is how to be a better friend. That sometimes when we're in a bad mood, if we kind of have a meltdown, we can really upset and almost traumatize the people around us. And so, there's a point at which Cloud says, now besides feeling grumpy, he felt bad because he's hurt Sun's feelings. And so it's about how he tries to, recapture their friendship. So I think I didn't count the number of pages, and it's not paginated, but it feels like about 12 or 13 pages. So it's a very short comic. But again, for perhaps the attention span of a very small person, although many of the ideas that are dealt with in this are not going to be all that different than the ones that we'll be talking about with Narwhal, Unicorn of the Sea as well. So what did you think, Paul?
Yeah, well, I am interested in a book like this because I think that the role of literacy and early literacy, including board books like this, in the very early stages of kids' social emotional learning is something really interesting to me. And to have a book called I'm Grumpy and to have these things happen and to have the spectrum of emotions that I'm grumpy is meant to show. I think there's actually a book, or a accompanying book called I'm Sunny that, came out at the same time as this book, which is funny because Jennifer and Matthew Holm, of course, one of the things that they've done is Sunny Side Up, a book that I think has great emotional range. Obviously for an older audience, I think you guys talked about it on the podcast, but, I think it's great to have this range of emotional, I think knowledge, self-knowledge and ability to express at a very early age. And I love that they're using the conventions and tools of comics for board books, which just to me makes so much sense. I have to admit, though, that's probably the extent of my thoughts because this is the one book on the list that I actually didn't get in time for our conversation. It's in the mail, but I haven't received it. So I've seen the preview pages on Amazon, but that's all I've seen of I'm Grumpy. I haven't actually gotten to experience the full 12-page melodrama as it plays out.
Well, and this is really where I come in as a bit of a curmudgeon, not just a grump, but a curmudgeon. And, I love Jennifer and Matt Holm. I think their Baby Mouse series is amazing. They've done some really great comics that are part of the collection that I think one of them actually co-edits the Lunch comics. Yeah, the really fun
Comic Squad.
Series. Comic Squad, that's it. I was trying to remember what it's called.
Right.
And so I don't necessarily, compared to other books that maybe could have been put on this list, I'm a little surprised to see this book there. Not because I don't think it's a fine book, it is, but there's another book that I'm going to mention, Paul, that is missing from the list, and that's Hippopotamister. And to me, Hippopotamister was a far, far, far stronger book. Probably probably one of the strongest books that was released in the last 5 to 10 years in comics. And not seeing it here is really kind of surprising to me. And I understand that, you're going to have a variety of different readers making these decisions. This is a great little book, but it's doing something that I think is really important. But from a narrative standpoint, I'm not sure that that it is as strong as some other books that could have been put into this category. So while I enjoyed it, there isn't a lot to talk about because it's a very short comic. And again, it's fulfilling its purpose. So if you're sitting at home and you have a little child or niece or nephew, or you teach kindergarten, this is a great book, or preschool, probably actually more appropriately. This would be a great book to have in your collection. And I think it's done very well. Yeah. And there are ways in which the panel layout is set out. We have full page panels. I mean, if you were to ask me to make a list of things that I would want a young comics reader to notice, they're happening in this book. Mm-hmm. But I tend to think, and maybe this is getting my bias, and maybe we want to talk about that. I'm also looking for narrative depth, and that's not something, I mean, you get some of that here, but that's not something that's as an important, I think, consideration in a book for this particular audience. And so it's not a knock at this particular book, but it's just a questioning about what are we going to value in this category for young readers? And when we start to think about a book like Bear the One-Headed Troll, which is so unbelievably sophisticated, even though very approachable for a very young reader, and it's dealing with some really profound questions about autonomy and about bravery. And, you look at Hippopotamuster, which also is teaching a lot of principles about comics, but is a more sustained narrative. And I guess for me, that's where this particular category this year was a little surprising to me, that there were some of those books that I think were really super sophisticated and didn't make it to the final short list. But that said, if you're like wanting to introduce a very young reader to the comics medium, I think it's a great choice. And so I mean, maybe it's good that's maybe part of the point of this category, is just to give different types of book exposure. And if that's the goal more than anything, then I think it was a really great selection, because I think it's important for readers to know that there are these books out there. Yeah.
And just to add the note that Hippopotamuster is by John Patrick Green, and it was from First Second. That's a book that I've bought copies of to give to parent friends and stuff like that. But and I don't think I agree with you. I think that's well put, Gwen. No need to diminish anything that is on the list, but definitely got to ask questions about things that were really of merit, of note. The titles that you've already mentioned that aren't in these categories, aren't in these nominees. And I think that is a tough task and a tall task, because even though a lot of the Eisner categories might seem ultra specific to people on the outside, say comics from 0 to 8, or, even something like, best reprint publication from Asia or what, it's actually within each of those categories, there's such a broad range that, it's really hard to narrow down to 5 or 6 of the best. And, I think, again, I agree with you. That's not to take anything away from either I'm Grumpy itself or even the category of books and comics that it represents. But, that's just some tough decision making. To be honest, I don't envy the Eisner judges. I do envy them because they get to read a ton of comics, but I don't envy the task of having to narrow down that list.
Yeah, I think that's actually much more difficult. Once you have a short list, I think at least there, the universe is more constricted. You can make those arguments or whatever. But well, actually, to end on a cheerful note for this category, Paul, why don't you raise our mood with what I think is probably one of the most feel good comics I've read in a long time.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about Narwhal, Unicorn of the Sea by Ben Clanton from Tundra Books. I didn't know about it until this list, and I think it's probably the title that I'm most glad that this list introduced me and my daughter to. And so a special thanks to Tundra Books for sending us Narwhal, Unicorn of the Sea. And they also sent us actually the second book in the series that was just, I think just out this year, just out recently, which is entitled Super Narwhal and Jelly Jolt. And so, and I think one thing interesting, as you were saying about whether this category is comics folks who are doing comics for young kids, or whether it's children's books folks who are venturing into the world of comics. Clanton is the author of It Came in the Mail and Something Extraordinary and Rex Rexit and a lot of other children's books that I think is more of the sort of, children's book author and illustrator moving into the comics realm. But in any case, Jellyfish, who's also on the cover and is Narwhal's friend, buddy, sidekick, encounters Narwhal, and a lot of the comic is Jellyfish making sense of the wonder that is Narwhal, this sea creature that has a horn, like a unicorn. And so there's a lot of fun, Narwhal facts. There's different sea creatures who join Narwhal's pod of awesomeness, and there's actually a little Narwhal song that, even though it doesn't have a melody, my daughter just loved that page and made up a million melodies to go with those lyrics.
Oh, that is so awesome.
As she was reading it, it became Hamilton, actually. It was like Hamilton melodies with Narwhal lyrics. So I think that, the book is really well represented by one of the stories where, Narwhal has a book that is actually blank pages. It's like the best book that you could possibly have. And the blank pages are meant to represent the opportunity that your imagination gets to fill in the pages and the story. And so, I think that empty book kind of reminds me of part of Clanton's charm, which is to recognize that, it just really takes a few simple elements, a painted blue background, some, really simple drawings that kind of have a sort of pastel quality of line. And all that is just evocative enough to create a lot of enthusiasm and, the pleasures of companionship and food and things like that. So, we loved it. We were totally charmed by Narwhal, and glad that we got to read both of these.
If I weren't in my 50s, I think I would hire someone to paint my entire interior of my house with scenes from this book, because it's just so awesome. Yeah. I love, right at the very beginning, when Jellyfish and Narwhal meet each other, they have this interesting conversation where Jellyfish says, "Whoa, what are you?" And right. He says, "Me?
Right.
I'm a Narwhal, the Narwhal, a Narwhal. Yep, unicorn of the sea." Yeah. And this is great. Yeah. Jellyfish says, "Are you real?" And Narwhal says, "Last time I checked, are you?" And it just starts off this really, and Narwhals, people, they are real. Right. You can look them up. Right. They are nearly endangered. So right. On a really serious note, if you love this Narwhal, we must protect the seas, because these poor Narwhals have been kind of really almost decimated. They can live to be, well, it says the Science-y that I looked up suggested that they can live 50 years, but in, I think, our follow-up volume, when we learn some more facts about Narwhal, we find out that they say it can live to be 90. So they can live to be 50 or 90, and that is quite a spread. Yeah. But they're really quite adorable. And this story I like the use of color. Again, this is another book that uses blue and yellow very effectively, sort of the way that Holm and Jennifer and Matt Holm do with the My First Comic text. But God, the other thing is they love waffles. And so, right. There's and their imaginary book is this idea of this ninja waffle who beats up this robot. So it has things for all these sorts of themes that the young people enjoy. Yeah. But I just love the illustrations. The line style is simple and yet very evocative. I mean, if you'd asked me to draw a jellyfish, and this looks like a really simple drawing, it's not. There's a lot of personality that comes across in these two characters, even though they're drawn very simply. Yeah.
It's almost like I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. It's a deceptive simplicity. It's actually, you can tell there's a lot of thought and even a kind of professionalism put into it. One giveaway of that is that there's a lot of places where what I think was called zipatone, but it's that sort of dot effect. That makes it look like, old newsprint, and it's used really judiciously and creates a certain effect of something kind of classic. And again, kind of simple in that old newspaper comic strip kind of way, but still, really, really thoughtful, really sophisticated. I mean, I guess my best summary is, for my feelings about Narwhal is that my daughter and I read this book when we were having a little date at Denny's, and we used to do that every week, and still something we do now and then. And we were just sitting kind of by the window at Denny's and reading it, and had a ball reading it. And we happened to bring along a pad of paper, and then instantly we were recreating and drawing Narwhal and Jelly and drawing dialogues between them. And so I don't know, something about that kind of mood or moment that there's a childlike simplicity that is just really sweet. And I loved it.
And it's interesting because a lot of the same themes that are present in, oh my gosh, can you believe that this book is sitting next to me? I'm still like, okay, Ape and Armadillo take over the world. Mm-hmm. There are so many similar themes here about what it means to be a good friend, to be a thoughtful person. And I really like the way that, at first I found Jellyfish to be kind of annoying. He just was so conventional and a worrywart. And in some ways you could even look at this as a nice companion to I'm grumpy because you have Sunny is a lot like, let's be real. Narwhal has a very sunny disposition, but he's not a pushover, and he's not like a Pollyanna. He's actually just very matter of fact. In fact, I would argue that though this is not a book about bullying, a lot of the responses that Narwhal has to the questions that Jelly initially asks him are really good strategies for someone who might be bullied and wouldn't be sure what to say. Right. There's just a certain confident self-acceptance that Narwhal possesses and expresses in this text that I think without again it being super preachy, I think that it comes across as kind of a manual of how to deal with someone who's being somewhat defensive towards you and maybe is treating you in a way that you don't like. But then once they get along and everyone's feelings are soothed over, we have this exciting superhero motif again, which is something that goes through all of these books. So there really is something for every reader in this text, I think. Yeah, for sure. And I just want to echo that about Narwhal, but also about a lot of the books in this category. Again, coming back to my daughter, if you'll forgive my endless referencing of the fact of my having a kid. My favorite reader.
She is. I can't wait for you to meet her one day. She's really fun. But I do think a lot about. She's an only child, and so the thought about how much of her social emotional learning is tied to books, and tied to our reading together. And I always think about how for books to show kids how to play together, they have to show how kids actually play together. But and also coming to resolve and learn things and to express themselves and to understand each other. And so Narwhal does that in the ways that you described. I think a lot of the books in this list do that, and for that I think they're good. They're good.
They are.
Yeah.
So our next category is Best Publication for Kids aged 9 to 12, what I guess we might refer to as the middle grade reader, although that's, the category is a little fluid here. The 5 texts that we'll be looking at are begin with The Drawing Lesson by Mark Crilley. Paul, one of the things that I found interesting about this particular text is its treatment of instruction, in this case, drawing instruction, alongside a really pretty strong and cohesive narrative.
Right.
And so to sort of give our readers a sense for how this book unfolds, it's called The Drawing Lesson, but there is a subtitle, and the subtitle is A Graphic Novel That Teaches You How to Draw. Yeah. So there is sort of a direct address at some points to the reader, certainly in the title, but right from the very beginning, there's an introduction that the author puts in, that Crilley puts in, about how he learned to draw and how difficult it can be to learn to draw, how it takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of patience, and it also takes a willingness to listen. to instruction. And so the basic premise of the text is that there's a young man who absolutely loves to draw and who wants to do it well. And he comes upon a woman who's in the park and she's drawing, and he mentions how much he thinks her drawing is beautiful. They engage in a conversation, and one of the things that he begs her ultimately is to teach him how to draw. He says, I want to be able to draw like you. And so, this begins a lengthy sort of interaction between the two, where it goes from her teaching him how to draw a watch face accurately in their first lesson to, and that's called Drawing What You See. And it goes through where he starts, I'm not going to say he's stalking her, but he really wants some drawing lessons. And so he comes to her place of work, he comes to her home. Right. And Paul, I don't know if you felt this way after you finished the text, but on the one hand, I thought, wow, I learned a lot about drawing and about seeing from this text. It's an extremely technically interesting book.
Yes.
It's well drawn. It's captivating. And I think a young person who wanted to learn to draw would be very well served by this text. But there's like a part of me that looked at the narrative, and if you stand back and you think about what goes on here, it feels a lot like The Giving Tree to me. Shel Silverstein's like the really negative aspects, insofar as by the end, the art teacher, I mean, I don't think this is giving anything away because it's not a book that I think there's a lot of suspense here. The art teacher's moving away, and there was a part of me that kind of thought, is she literally moving away to get away from this kid? And it's like, there was a way in which this child's need to like learn to draw is so strong that he may be like literally getting people to like put their houses for sale and move away. And of course there's a really sweet coda at the end where he's sitting somewhere as an adult, an accomplished artist, and a young child comes up to him and has a very similar conversation, and he pulls out his watch and teaches the child how to draw a watch face, and you can see that he's now paying it forward. So but there was just this little part of me that was, and I don't think you're necessarily not supposed to think that. I think the author wants you to sort of say, wow, maybe it would be better to give a kid this book.
That's funny. That's really good.
Than to be followed around like this. But there's no question that you will learn something about drawing, whether you were a child or an adult. Yeah. So, Paul, what did you think about this text?
Yeah. I enjoyed it too. I learned a lot from it. I took a lot of drawing lessons as a kid, but I wish I had this book when I was a kid. And I think, first, thanks to Watson-Guptill Publications for a review copy. They also sent us a review copy of something Crilley has done called Manga Art. And I think that book is actually a better example of what Crilley often does. He has a lot of instructional books. He also has videos. If you go to YouTube and look up his last name, there's a lot of instructional videos that he does about drawing and comics and things like that. Mostly drawing, I think. But what was really interesting to me about the drawing lesson, and I think why it's in this category, is exactly what you say, is to embed instructional stuff in a narrative, right? And sometimes that means maybe a less the narrative is there to serve the teaching. But, thinking as a teacher, I think that it's another example, and I would put things like Jean Luen Yang and Mike Holmes' Secret Coders in this category too, where it just kind of shows off how great comics are as teaching tools. Because you get all of the stuff that, good teaching often entails, which is visuals and diagrams and examples and counter examples, like what to do, what not to do. And you see that a lot in a drawing class, or you see that a lot in a traditional drawing instruction book. But what it also includes in having a narrative is all of the other stuff that's actually a part of teaching and learning that you often don't represent if you don't have that narrative, which is, the experience of setbacks and how you deal with them, or, making an error and, having it corrected, or being persistent in the face of things not, you try really hard to draw something really well and it just doesn't come out right. And what do you do with that response? And the relationship between the, very eager and persistent kid and his teacher, kind of gives you narratively, or gives kids and us a chance narratively to experience those things. And I think those are so important, so integral to the learning process, that it's why I think this book works so well as drawing instruction. Because if you take the idea of teaching and learning and instruction as more than just here's the skills, here's the facts of what to know, but also the relationship of, you as an observer to the world around you, or, again, what do you do when you face a setback? I think the narrative kind of allows the learner to experience that vicariously through the character. I totally agreed with you that it is lightweight creepy that this kid shows up on her doorstep when she's not expecting it, asking for the drawing lessons. I thought that was really funny. But I felt the same way. I was like, I hope kids learn from this how to draw, not how to pursue a teacher or a tutor.
I know. It's like, this is not how to mentor or how to work with a mentor,
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Although, I was going to say that it does remind me of a lot of people I know who are artists, and the feeling that they often have that, and this is a terrible generalization, but sometimes artists, the things about them that make them great artists don't necessarily make them great teachers. And so I have a few artist acquaintances and friends who've told me that to learn from people, they often had to be a little persistent, a little dogged, and to sometimes it felt a little bit like somebody was setting up hoops for them to jump through. But oftentimes, as in a lot of trades and fields, that was actually the best kind of mentorship, was somebody kind of giving it to them straight about where they were off base and where they were making progress. And I think that the relationship maybe is meant to reflect that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because probably part of this for me is, sort of empathizing with Becky, because the first time he comes over to her house, it's like 7 a.m. or something ridiculous. And, I was just like, oh my gosh, kid, but on the other hand, it also shows you persistence. I mean, I think that there are ways in which, a lot of times people I had a deep desire to draw, but I didn't have the patience. And I didn't have the patience for the violin. And I mean, I could make a whole list of things. What I did have patience for was sitting still and reading. And that's why I'm where I am today. So I think that it also is an important text in terms of understanding that, if you find something that you're passionate about, it's going to take a lot of work, and work that you might not always be glamorous, might not always be easy.
Right.
The protagonist, David, has to draw certain objects 10, 15, 20 times sometimes before he gets to a place where he feels that he has truly captured what he's seen. And I think that's a nice model. It's a very fascinating take on how to teach something, whether it's comics or not. And I do think it would be a really fun book for a young person to read through, and they would certainly, I think it would encourage them to move on to other texts. And like you said, I mean, that new one about manga looks really interesting. And this is really I thought it was an unexpected book, actually, for me, for sort of complaining a little bit earlier about how some of the books I've noticed recently, not just in this list, but in general, there's a lot of repetition of theme, etc. This was really a fresh, new kind of text for me. It was different than what I had expected.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe all that other stuff I said, I don't want to undersell that. It's actually just really good drawing instruction, just to be technical, like some of the best explanation of negative space that I've seen. And just the ways that Crilley uses oftentimes line thickness or different ways of highlighting the observer, what the observer is looking at as they draw, and, explaining the need for a sense of proportion and things like that. It's just a good drawing lesson as well.
It's sort of, in many ways, like a McCloud text.
But
for younger readers. And so in that respect, it felt familiar. But it also felt really fresh and different. So kind of got a hat tip that. I realized I didn't read the whole category when we started. Sorry, listeners.
No, that's okay.
But why don't I go through the rest of the category, and then Paul, you can take us into the next text. So
sounds good.
The other 4 texts, besides the drawing lesson by Mark Crilley, Watson, and Guptill Press. We have Ghosts by Raina Telgemeier out of Scholastic's Graphics imprint. We have Hilda in the Stone Forest by Luke Pearson out of Flying Eye Books, which is maybe the best name for a publisher ever. Although I would want to say my name of my publisher would be Duck. But anyway, we have Rikki, adapted by Norm Harper and Matthew Foltz-Gray, which is an adaptation of a Kipling story by Karate Pet Shop, which again, great name for a publisher.
Yes.
And then Science Comics Dinosaurs by M.K. Reed and Joe Flood out of First Second Books. So those are the texts that are the total list of entries in this category.
Yes,
Paul,
indeed.
why don't we start on this book called Ghost by Telgemeier? That name Telgemeier, it's so unfamiliar to me.
This is definitely the marquee blockbuster book in this category. Although I think there are a lot of things in this category that we've paid attention to, and I should just refer listeners to the discussion, the extensive conversation that you and Andy had about the book, both when you reviewed it and in the episode after it, where you commented on some of the maybe some of the problematic aspects of the book. But yeah, of course, it's Raina Telgemeier, so it's been an enormous bestseller and also widely read. And I've said some things about the book in the past. I liked it. I thought it was doing some important things. It moved me. It has all of Telgemeier's gifts on display. Some of the things about culture and representation of culture and appropriation of culture that you and Andy discussed in your conversation, that again, if our listeners haven't heard it, I really highly recommend it, that you go back and listen to those episodes. You sort of can't get those out of your mind as you read or reread it. But I should also say that I think that Ghost's perspective and treatment on death has been something that I've appreciated, and that as I read it with my kid, and for us, close personal family and the end of life is a real thing. And I've thought often about how you process that with a young person, and so just to have, I guess, different ways of thinking about death from what they sort of pick up in the culture more widely. That's something that I've appreciated. So for all the hype that it is as a Telgemeier work, and as a sort of New York Times bestseller type of comic, I do think that there is something at its heart, at its intention, that I appreciate. And I don't think it's my favorite of her books, but it is one that, for example, I actually gave as a gift to my mother, and she couldn't make it through. She couldn't actually read the whole thing because of her vision. It was kind of sweet to read some of that together with my mom and my daughter, and appreciated that.
Yeah, it's, we have to, the elephant in the room here is Telgemeier is almost solely responsible for 1/3 of this category in terms of, the entire young reader category in terms of sales.
Right.
So she is touching readers in a major way.
Right.
And I do think that, and this is, we're not kidding there. This is like literally 1/3.
Right.
It's interesting, Paul, because when we talk about the Eisners, and I'm always excited when these categories and texts are released, but I'm equally excited, honestly, in September at New York Comic Con to learn about what has happened in the year. Usually Martin Griep of ICV2, I think,
Yep.
puts out this wonderful white paper. And last year, the focus of, actually the last 2 years, the focus of his discussion of young readers has been on Raina, and 10 million comics sold, or $10 million worth of comics sold in 2016 for Telgemeier alone.
Right.
So in many ways, her success is helping to buoy a lot of other authors. And so she has a really important position in the field. And so I hope that, given everything that happened, and if readers are interested in my thoughts on the text, they can look to the August and September 2016 recordings that Andy and I did. But I will say that what I'm very interested in actually will be to see her next text. If she has, in fact, thought through some of the things that her critics have brought forward regarding representation and what her next comic will look like. And this is important because I mean, this comic obviously was going to be on this list. It's been read probably by more kids than any other comic that we'll be talking about today.
Right.
And so for that very reason, of course, it means that there's a great deal more scrutiny on her work than there would be if it were the first time either of us were picking up a copy and it was maybe a first effort by a comics creator.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what I will say about it. I think it does. I think that the sad thing for me is that there are some moments of true transcendence in terms of both the art and in terms of a meditation on how we come to terms with death, especially the death of a loved one, that unfortunately get kind of buried within some other issues in the text. So again, I would more sort of point towards what's next for this comics creator and what she will have taken away from her experience. I will actually be very surprised if this text doesn't win the category, actually. So I have a feeling that it will have an Eisner sticker on it, which means it will be published forever. And so, the only thing I'll say is, it would be wonderful if at some point Tegelmeier might want to more directly address some of the questions that have come up out of this text, but we shall see. So, it's from just a technical perspective, it's a beautiful comic.
Right.
And so, it will be interesting to see what her next text is. I'm really looking forward to that. So, yeah.
I mean, and I guess I always think about talking about her work and her, and maybe this is unfair to me on the part of others in the way that I talk about their work, but I always think about just the notion, mostly from me thinking about basketball, of just how hard it is at the top.
Yes.
that there is, as you said, that kind of scrutiny and the kind of burden of expectations, and you may. You get to take home the sort of New York Times, not only topping the list, but really populating the list and the millions of dollars or whatever. But you also have a heavy responsibility, as somebody like J.K. Rowling, for instance, knows well, because you are just such a huge part of the market. And so I think as I wouldn't say we're under her umbrella or shadow, but I think we have much to thank, or just to be glad and grateful for Tegelmeier's popularity about, but also, I mean, I think that means that there's a lot of problematic issues that this text is going to get, and deservingly going to get, scrutiny about, and things that we as a readership need to be learning about that play out in the response to this text. So
right.
Yeah.
And another good person to look to who's an ambassador for comics is Gene Luen Yang, who shares that with Tegelmeier in many respects. Yep. And he himself has come out and had some conversations about this very topic. So but at any rate, it is a comic that I think probably the majority of our listeners right now probably have already read. And so it's, again, I will be very surprised if, normally we don't talk about that, but I will be very surprised if this text doesn't win the category, just because it has had a pretty profound impact on comics this year. And, but at any rate, we might want to move on.
Let's move forward.
To I think I will take us into Hilda in the Stone Forest by Pearson. This is flying iBooks, and again, just hats off to the publisher because wow. And this is a series, actually. It's part of a series. So again, we have a situation where this is not the first book in the series. The first one was simply called Hilda and the Troll. We have Hilda and the Midnight Giant, Hilda and the Bird Parade, and Hilda and the Black Hound. And I have to say, Hilda's a great protagonist. She has, first of all, in the sort of tradition of Hergé, and this book feels very much like a European comic, both in terms of its size, its drawing style, its color. It's an adventure comic. And what's really fascinating to me is it's almost like taking Hergé and putting a young woman into the center of like the 1010 universe, who also has a companion animal and who also has these really fast-paced adventures. And Paul, I have to tell you something funny. It's not funny, it's sad, but this book was left by, first of all, we really want to thank Flying Eye for sending us copies. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, my book was left out like the cake in the rain by our local Upsky, and so it's my experience of reading it was like I had to dry the pages first. So I have a sort of 3D effect going for me, but with some of the pages. But it's this really fanciful adventure story that takes place in the city of Trollberg. So already we're kind of, trolls are just like, if you were a troll right now, you are in every comic for kids practically. It's like, congratulations.
Yes.
And what the Pearson does is what Hergé did and what a lot of other Clearline writers do. They really pay attention to the movement from panel to panel, and they use a number of techniques to show the fast pace at which the story is occurring. And there's this wonderful scene about maybe a fifth of the way into the text where we've begun with Hilda, who starts off the comic running, and she's running to try and chase this thing that's stolen the house of these little creatures, and she runs into these stone trolls. There's all of this adventure going on, but then because of all of this, and she's gotten so distracted, she's late for dinner, and her mom is like not happy with her, and so there's this wonderful scene where the comic slows down, boom, like you've been running and running and running, and then suddenly you're at the dinner table. Right. And so this is a text that relies on this a number of times, where there's this fast-paced action, and just as in an action-adventure movie, the pacing is such that you'll have these little interludes where things slow down, and you get more character development, and so there's a nice balance between movement, action, narrative, and then these moments of reflection, and where you get a lot of character development, and you learn some things about the characters and their backgrounds and that sort of thing. So it's a beautiful, beautiful text, and I think one that is not just lovely in terms of its drawing, but as an artifact.
Right, yeah.
Even though mine was wet and is now warped, it is a beautiful artifact. And I think it's sort of like, that's why when we were talking about, the creeps in the previous category, it's one of those situations where I think your wish was granted here, Paul, because you get that same level of intensity, color, and busyness, but you get it in a much larger format.
Yeah. And the large format makes it so that you can get lost in these pages. And, it reminds me of the experience of reading Tintin as a kid. Absolutely. And the large size and the way that the panels read, when they have so much space to do storytelling. It's, something that I think we don't get as many regular doses of as even, back in the Winsor McKay Nemo time, when the newspaper comics could just be spread out, and you just so much get lost in the world because the page size is so huge. It's kind of a phenomenal feeling, and I'm glad that my daughter gets to experience that as she reads Hilda. Flying Eye does a really good job with their production values, and in fact, even their other stuff. My daughter just read a book that I forget the author's name, but it's something like Arthur and the Golden Rope or something like that. That Flying Eye Books put out. That again, similar in its sort of large size, and your eyes, even your body holding the book up, becoming immersed in that is part of the experience. But absolutely, it's all that sort of whimsy and adventure. And I think, this story, Stone Forest, I liked it even better than the previous Hilda stories, and I liked them all. Bird Parade was actually nominated for an Eisner, in 2014. And that one ended with, Hilda mentioning to her mom that maybe they could have adventures together, because reading this as a parent, especially the early stories, you do have this like, wow, this is really fun, but where is her, does her mom know what she's doing? She's just out there running around doing crazy things. And it's great. It's actually the kind of freedom that kids ought to have to explore, but, I think the Stone Forest is unique in that, mom really gets wrapped up in the adventure herself.
And I would also add that mom's social life
Right.
has been lacking. And in some ways, there's this wonderful conversation that occurs, and another one of those sort of stop moments where basically they're having this argument because Frida, her friend, had called and wanted her to spend the night, and her mom said, "No, you can't. We have this night planned together. We have family time. We're going to play a game. I've got dinner planned."
Right.
And Hilda says, "Mom, I just spent all day with you." And her mom walks right into it really and says, "So am I such bad company?" And she says, "No, it's just, you're just a mom."
Right.
And she says, "Why do I have to keep you company all the time? It's not my fault that you sit around on your own all day and don't have anyone else to talk to." Yeah. And of course, the mom's response, understandably, is go to your room, which would have been mine too. Right. But it's sort of a sweet moment. Well, of course, they then end up in this adventure together where they spend lots of time together. Right,
and encounter all the trolls and birds and everything that are part of Hilda's adventures. Yeah, and I think in that sense, even though each series stands on its own, you can see that now that Pearson has a good rhythm going of this being the, several volumes into the story, there's maturation that's happening with Hilda, at every step. And a lot of, it reads well enough on its own, but I think if you've read the previous Hilda, it's even more satisfying, especially when, you see developments with Twig, her pet and stuff like that. It's just much more satisfying. Speaking of satisfying, I also want to mention that the ending of this book, and I don't want to spoil anything, is really very moving. And, I teared up and my heart was warmed, but then that actually wasn't the actual ending. And I won't say anything more than that, but, there's a great, that's something to enjoy. And then I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but it seems like there's, Hilda is now a thing, and there's actually a TV show on the way from Netflix, or on Netflix that's supposed to come out in 2018. And so I think Hilda's popularity is only going to continue and to grow. And that's a cool thing, in my eyes.
And just really quickly, too, from a visual standpoint, this is a somewhat complicated comic. I know I wrote that in my notes that I sent to you before we went on. In much the same way as the Creeps, there's a lot of busyness on many of these pages. And sometimes the waffle grid is honored in the sense that there are definitely spaces between the panels, and the panels are set up in a grid format. But then there are other points where the spaces are completely erased, and there's really just a thin borderline between the panels. And sometimes you can have as many as 16 or 20 panels on a page. So there's, it does a lot of things in terms of forwarding the narrative in respect to time, but it can be confusing too. So for a much younger reader, I think it would be a text where reading it with an adult chaperone might be a good idea. But I'm sure that your daughter just could go sit off somewhere and open it up and just have a good old time with it. So, it's not difficult to understand what's happening. I'm just saying that from a visual standpoint, it's very crowded. Unlike I would say, the 1010 series where the pretty consistent waffle grid is there as a major characteristic. So. Right,
that's true. Actually, the very first time we read Hilda, we did read it together, and I think she would have gotten a bit lost if we hadn't. But by this point, she's read enough Hilda that she's pretty well on her own along the journey.
You're on your own, kid.
That's right. That's right. All right, so I think that brings us to the second to last of this category, which is Rikki, which is adapted by Norm Harper and Matthew Foltz-Gray from Karate Pet Shop Press, as you said.
Of course, Karate Pet Shop.
Karate Pet Shop, of course, but adapted from the Rudyard Kipling story, which is part of Jungle Book, Rikki Tikki Tavi. And I actually got to meet Norm Harper at Alternative Press Expo this last October.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah. And I was really impressed, sort of walking around. There's a lot of cool stuff there, obviously, but I was really impressed with this book. And Mr. Harper had really high praise for artist Matthew Foltz-Gray, which was really apparent as soon as you look at the cover and pick up the artwork. It's astounding. But I didn't really get to read it until afterwards and to appreciate actually as writer how much he had done in adapting the story. And after that was very, very fond of this. And so when I found out that this, what seemed seemed to me a little talked about book wound up on the nominees list, I was totally thrilled. And I want to thank Norm and Karate Pet Shop Press for sending us these review copies. But it's an adaptation of a story. And actually, I don't know if you know this, but Rikki Tikki Tavi shows up in textbooks all the time. And
does it? Okay.
Yeah. And so I know a lot of middle school teachers who end up teaching it. But the story text is actually included in the full, the short story in the back of the book, which is really fun because I think kids can read the comic and contrast that with the original prose. And I think there's a lot that's done in the retelling, a lot of extrapolation and adaptation. And, there's a modern setting and a number of story and character elements that I feel like make it feel a lot like a studio animation movie, and there's a lot of different aspects that we could talk about that more, but it's essentially the story of a mongoose, Tavi, who belongs to a pack of mongooses, which actually is called a mob. You can call them a pack or a mob, but mongooses, including a female mongoose who he's engaged to, and whose father is the head of the pack, who's unimpressed by Tavi. And so Tavi has to prove himself as they build, as mongoose are wanted to do, to build their home and try to protect themselves from their, natural enemies, the cobras, but also from humans and human development that's destroying habitats represented by these big, construction trucks and stuff. And there's a relationship with a wise elder mongoose by his side and all that. And so the story kind of continues. But I think the rhythms of the story, it's really remarkable. I think it really feels like a well-developed animated film. And first, because I think Matthew Foltz-Gray is an incredible artist and has that kind of animator's mastery of characterization and expression for animal creatures and also for human ones. But the ability also to create setting and place, the use of color and light. It's just, super, super professional. And I may be wrong about this. I got the impression that, Mr. Foltz-Gray is actually a pretty young artist. So that's, very, very impressive. But I think, story-wise, actually, it had a few things working against it for me because, first of all, I'm not a big Rudyard Kipling fan for colonialism reasons, and also, I've known so many teachers who have had to teach Rikki Tikki Tavi that they're quite tired of the story, as well as the fact that my wife is deathly afraid of snakes. So anytime there's snakes in images of the house, I have to cover them up. That said, I think that the storytelling is so well done in this book that it was just both a breezy read and repaid some rereading. So I really liked Rikki.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. And I will say that from a visual standpoint, it was just like watching an animated film. And yet the advantage of comics we know is that readers have the chance to really linger on the images, to think about what they mean. I mean, the story is very familiar. I'm glad that because the story upon which it's based is short enough to include, I'm glad they did, because if you're talking about utilizing a class in a text in the classroom, having the original included in this, what would be a very expensive text for the class, is helpful. It makes another argument for an educator to include some copies of this in the classroom. Right. I think that at the level of expression, there's a lot that's added in this adaptation from the original. In other words, I think it's possible to identify with the characters in a deeper way. Yes. Because of that, I do agree with you that in general, Kipling is not my favorite. So when I saw this on the list, I was like, oh, great. All right. But I will say that the material is I think, enhanced in certain ways by the visual narrative. And it's definitely a text that I think if I were to teach, if I were ever to teach this, I would be teaching the visual narrative as opposed to just the text only now, because I think this is a really, really great comic technically. And the coloration, I mean, I talk a lot about color because I really am interested in the way that it creates mood within a comic. And, let's face it, many of the characters in this comic are under a lot of stress. They're, it's an adventure comic, but there's real life and death issues at play here. Right. And color does a lot in terms of increasing suspense, especially in many of the scenes that are almost entirely in darkness. Right. That's handled extremely well and really adds to the feeling of suspense. And I would not be giving this book to your wife, however.
Lots of snakes.
Yeah. Right. And I'm not particularly fond of them either. I far prefer encountering a dinosaur, which we're going to talk about in a minute.
The next, right.
Yeah. So I will admit that you're right. I mean, I had a lot of barriers to overcome, but to read it. But I thought it was done beautifully. I mean, I would be very interested to see the same team turn their focus onto maybe a more contemporary story or even a more contemporary adaptation. I've been thinking a lot about adaptation because Snow White did not make the cut to the Eisners this year, and it would have been in this category. It's a primarily wordless comic by Matt Phelan, a variant of the Snow White story that I think was very rich and very well done. But of course, it's a much more streamlined treatment. This, on the other hand, feels as dense as the original. I mean that in a positive sense. I mean, the story itself is very rich with detail, and Kipling is a very visual writer, and so there was a lot to go on there. But I think that there are some scenes, as I said before, where you can really look at the original, you can look at the way that it's been adapted, and you can really get a sense for the choices that the author and the comics creator made there to what to emphasize, what not to emphasize, which actually in and of itself is a really valuable lesson. I haven't taught Snow White yet. I'm planning to probably next year. And one of the things that I'll do is we'll go through the original and then look at the adaptation and talk about those choices. So just from a pedagogical standpoint, this would be a good text for teachers who are going to be teaching this text anyway to enter into their classroom library. And to echo that, both on the sort of large scale of how do you adapt in terms of the, additions, changes, adjustments of the character arcs, introducing new sources of tension and conflict. So both in the big picture storytelling and really in the scene by scene storytelling and the way that adaptation is done there. Again, I think there's a lot of the influence of, animated films, but, it's so readable. It's so, engaging. It's so clear that, the level of professionalism, and I hope that doesn't make it sound too cold, but, the level of professionalism in this work makes it stand out to me as something that I think if there's one book in all of these lists that I would just say, if somebody were to ask, what's something that a relatively comics cognizant person isn't paying attention to that this list offers us a chance to highlight, it would be this one for me, to say, you may not have noticed this or seen this, but it's really something. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on to our last text in the category.
Yeah.
This last year, First Second Books introduced a new series called Science Comics with the tagline, Get to Know Your Universe, which, given what's going on in science education or miseducation, is really a good topic.
Yes.
Yes, young people, there is science, and here's some. And so, but that said, each of these stories involves sort of nonfiction informative information, along with a narrative, which is starting to sound very familiar. But this book, Science Comics, Dinosaurs, Fossils, and Feathers, was actually among the first of the two books to be released in this series. The other was Science Comics, Coral Reefs, Cities of the Oceans, which was by Maris Wicks. Now, Science Comics, Dinosaurs is a collaboration between M.K. Reed and Joe Flood, and actually, Andy and I did review this text when it first came out. And reviewed it very positively. And some of the things that we noted really quickly, and then I'll turn it over to you because I'm really interested in what you think, is the way that this particular comic, because the creatures that are being focused on no longer exist for the most part. I think there's, isn't it? My gosh, I've forgotten because I only skimmed this again. But I know that there's some creatures we're still hanging out with in the bird realm that are technically like still like dinosaur-esque. But in the main, we don't have a triceratops hanging out down the road, so which is probably a good thing. But this book focuses on by nature of the topic, a lot of history, because there was such a debate, especially beginning in the 18th and into the 19th century, about what dinosaurs were, when they lived. All as sort of carbon dating became more available, people were able to have a deeper understanding for the true history of dinosaurs. So this text really focuses a lot on the debates that occurred among scientists that got to a level of such like literal violence and anger and passion. And this book captures that. So not only are young readers getting a sense for what dinosaurs are, how they lived, what their features are, which is a very important part of the text, but they're also getting a glimpse at history and at the way that competing scientists tried to develop a narrative of what was going on with these creatures. And in this respect, one of the nice things is that you get to look at some lesser known figures of history who contributed to our understanding of the science behind dinosaurs. So for instance, I'm looking here over on page 67, where the first woman to write a scientific paper about a dinosaur discovery was Professor Mignon Talbot of Mount Holyoke College. And you get a picture of her. And in 1911, she discovered a nearly complete, here I get to say something fun, Pulocosaurus Holyokensis.
Yeah, pretty good.
I love that. Hey, it's Mount Holyoke. Yep. Missing only the head, but 10 years later, the only specimen burned in a fire at the museum. Fortunately, a cast survives in Yale's Peabody Museum in New Haven. So, like, just in that one page, you learn about a figure that you might not have known about. You learn about how dinosaurs are named, and then you get a drawing that that Flood creates of what he thinks the head would look like based upon how the rest of the body looked. So you also get a sense for the kind of speculation that scientists often have to do in this particular field. To me, actually, I've read all of the science comics to date, and for me personally, this was the most engaging comic, not just because I love dinosaurs, but because to me the story itself is a story of what happens when scientists try to put forward a hypothesis, test it, and then have to alter their thinking. And how sometimes that's an easy process, and other times they go kicking and screaming, and that really humanizes science.
Yes.
And I was very happy to see this book in the category. I thought it was really a wonderful addition.
I agree. And I think, we can acknowledge its own merits. We can also acknowledge it as a representative of science comics as a series, and I think a perfect representative. You and I talked about Bats Learning to Fly by Fallon Cook, but I think this is a great example of what the science comics series is doing so well. And we lavish plenty of praise on First Second, and I think they deserve it for stuff like this line in this series. And I felt the same way. I love how the history of dinosaur discovery shows that science is very contingent, which is not to add any fuel to the fire of science deniers and skeptics, but not saying that we should quote unquote teach the debate when there's virtually no debate. But I'm very interested in, I guess you could call it the anthropology of science, how science works as a field, as a discourse, the process of discovery, and like you said, some of the very human drama, the people who were part of the process of discovery, like you mentioned. I love the story of Mary Anning, who is somebody who was really significant early on, but who was neglected in publications and in history, as it was documented at the time. And just the way that, there's these pages in, early on, it's, one that says in the year 1854, and there's these sort of facts as we knew them in 1854, right? Or scientific, hypotheses. And then in the year 1920, and then it sort of gets to in the year 2000 by the end. And so you get to see the sort of, historical time development of people's conceptions. And I think for kids to understand that that's how science works, as you were saying, it's just really, I think, really important to sort of historicize how scientific discovery is a process. I think that makes science feel like something that needs our ongoing contributions and participation. And, and it's just really well done by this book. I think that my favorite part is probably the Brontosaurus thing, where in the middle of the book, they talk about how Brontosaurus was, actually sort of discovered to be nothing but an apatosaurus. But on the, almost the very last page, Joe Flood and M.K. Reed are depicted having a headache because just weeks before publication, scientists redesignated Brontosaurus as its own genus again. And so you can see them going, oh, this is so awkward. What do we do with the Brontosaurus? We just drew a big denial of its own existence or something like that. So, I mean, it just gives you the sense that the field is exciting because it's not fixed. That discovery kind of continues. And I think, of the many great things that the science comic series do, I think that's one of the best for kids.
I have to explain to our listeners that sound you heard, and there's no way to edit it out, was the entirety of the young readers comics for this year for the first two categories falling on the floor off of my desk, but they're all okay.
Okay, you're okay?
Yeah, I'm fine too. But I do see how real this is. I do agree about that idea about the additive process. I'm going to extrapolate this out for a moment to something that I try to do with my own students, which is when we teach beginning researchers in English studies, one of the things that we want them to understand is that our knowledge is an additive process. No one is understanding or discovering anything where they can just say, this has come out of my own head, or I just plucked this out. There's always a web of associations involved. And one of the things that we teach our students is how to join the conversation.
Right. Yes.
How to become part of that dialogue. And I think that one of the nice things about this particular volume is that it does leave the door open for young readers, if they're interested in dinosaurs, if they're interested in this particular form of science, to see where they could, the debates and dialogues are ongoing, and that they can join those dialogues as well, as long as they get up to speed and have the appropriate training and education. So one of the things that this series does very well, I think, we talked about this with the series, the text that we looked at, where kids are given a very specific set of protocols they could follow if they're interested in becoming involved in rehabilitating bats and helping bats to have a more sustainable environment by putting up bat houses and things like that. I mean, this series is doing a really good service for young readers. It's providing entertainment, it's providing information, but it's also providing a practical pathway for those young people who go beyond just enjoying the comic to wanting to act.
Right.
And each of these texts, like with the coral reefs, it's protecting the coral reefs and that sort of science. With each of these volumes, there's something material that a young person can do if they want to pursue it. And I would actually equate it in a way to the drawing book that we looked at before, because a lot of the texts in this category are giving young readers, I think, probably a sense of empowerment that they have something to contribute. So I think that's a really nice aspect of it.
Yeah, and a good way to kind of bookend our discussion of this category, because we have at the front and at the end here comics that are educational. Maybe everything can be educational, and all of them are narrative in some sense, but the two books that I think lean a little bit more towards the informative educational slant at bookending our category. But I think overall this category has done a good job of, although it obviously has excluded some really good works that we would want to include in there, has included a nice little range of stuff on different parts of the story and informing spectrum, and also on big name and best-selling list publications, as well as ones that deserve some more attention. So I like it.
And Paul, I'm going to mention two other texts, right? Because
let's do it.
There are a couple that I want to mention for this category, and then one for the young adult that will get us into that category. For this category, there's just a couple books that I hope our readers will investigate further that I would have loved to have seen on the list. One is Compass South by Hope Larson and Rebecca Mock. And just for our listeners' information, Derek and I just conducted an interview with Larson and Mock about the follow-up text to this, and so which is called Knife's Edge. And so I think that interview will play later this month. So just a little plug for that. The other book that I really wish had been on was so innovative and so fascinating. It's called Camp Midnight, and it's by Stephen T. Siegel and Jason Katzenstein, coming out of Image Comics, and I just have to say that comic does some wonderful things with color. It does, again, it hits that theme of monsters and what we mean by what is monstrous. So just a sort of hat tip to those texts that I was a little surprised not to see showing up in the category. Although I think the middle grade category is probably the hardest right now, because this is the one that I think most publishers are focusing on, the traditional, like not just the traditional sort of mainstream comics publishers, but I would argue that many of the children's book publishers that now have comics imprints are really pushing that middle grade category. And so you're looking at so many good releases out of those houses as well. That's a category where you can forgive a lot of omissions because there's just so much that's being published. The other thing, if we want to move to young adult, that is missing out of the young adult category, that I know you're going to read us our list, so I'll turn that over to you in a second. But what you will notice that is not there is the March book 3 from the March series.
Yeah.
Now it is in another category.
Yes.
It's in the category for nonfiction comics. Right. But let's be real. In the past, it has actually been in this category as well. So there's a precedent for putting it there. And the only reason I mention this is earlier this year, the American Library Association had its major awards, and March book 3 did something that a children's or YA book has never done before, and that is to win 4 categories. And so this is a text that, and it of course won the National Book Award for young people. So that's 5 major awards up to the Eisners. And so part of me sort of wonders if it didn't make this list in part because the book has already been so decorated and applauded that people know about it. It's one of those books where it's not like a secret that the 3rd book is out and that it's a great book. But before you read the category, I just thought I would throw that out there because I think our listeners might be wondering, hey, wait a minute, I thought there was this really important book, and there was. And so it is in the nonfiction category in general, which I'm sure it will win. But
if I'm not mistaken, it's in another category as well. But
But anyway, just thought I would mention that before you give us our best publications for teens, ages 13 to 17.
Yeah, and we'll go into a little bit of a break before I go into that. But I just agree that those are definitely things that stand out as omissions. Some to the point that I'm shocked that they weren't on the list. But again, it's really hard to quibble with, picking the top 5 or 6. That's a tall task. On March, though, I think the episode that Andy and Derek discussed, Eisner nominees, the whole list, they talk a little bit about March and its significance, and also that it being the sort of closing volume of the trilogy also comes to represent the trilogy as a whole. And so, we definitely can't go without mentioning the impact of that very, very important series. So I think that is a good segue, though, to bring us into the publications for teens category. And just to read off this list before we go into each title, we have 6 nominees here, and it's a little bit of a different category. So we start with Bad Machinery, Volume 5, The Case of the Fire Inside by John Allison from Oni Press. Batgirl by Hope Larson and the aforementioned Hope Larson and Rafael Albuquerque from DC. And then we have Jughead by Chip Zdarsky, Ryan North, Erica Henderson, and Derek Charm from Archie, followed by Monstress by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda from Image. And then Trish Trash, Roller Girl of Mars by Jessica Abel from Paper Cuts or Super Genius. And finally, we cap it with The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl by Ryan North and Erica Henderson from Marvel. I'm pretty fired up to talk about these, to be honest. I think they include some works that we might not have covered on the Comics Alternative or not on the Young Reader podcasts, which is okay. But it's also really interesting how the teen market is being defined or described by these selections.
It's very interesting, actually. If I looked back over the last couple of years because I was sort of curious, because this is really a very mainstream list. Archie, DC, Marvel, those are I will say, typically more episodic works. There isn't really a lot of standalone work here. Even Trish Trash is part of a series. Right. And so is Monstress. And in fact, all these are series. And so the standalone graphic novel is sort of missing out of this. And that was a little bit surprising. But that said, what I find also to be really sort of fascinating is just the focus on fantasy and science fiction in this group. If you think about it, really, there are very few entries here that don't include some sort of magical element. And I think the only one that doesn't is Jughead. I think the rest really do. And to me, that in and of itself is sort of fascinating because it suggests a narrowness of focus that the category really isn't showing on to I think the outside world. There's the larger category of YA Lit, and of course it's been dominated over the last decade by supernatural, teen, paranormal, whatever romance, type categories. I love Barnes and Noble's choice of it's like paranormal teen romance. It's just it sounds like a really bad 1980s punk band, but anyway. But I will also say that some of these series are well along and quite established. So Bad Machinery is more of a, I think it's a comic that's pretty popular in Britain. This is volume 5. And so, we're also not just that we're showing like the first volumes of a collected series like with Jughead or The Unbelievable Squirrel Girl, but we're also looking at very long established comics. And so that's interesting. So all I will say about this is, I was talking to a publisher recently in preparation for this book that I'm writing, because I've also been writing a lot on specifically YA comics and how it's a part of the children's and YA market that hasn't been as attended to as the other two categories. So that probably explains a little bit of what is missing here. But I will also say that if you looked at this list, this is not representative of everything that's being done in YA comics. I think with the other categories, you could look at those categories and say, that's pretty much a good representation. What we were quibbling with was, there are maybe some texts that might be a better example of a particular category. But here, if this was all that you read this year, you would not have a full understanding, I think, of some of the YA work that's being done, especially, frankly, by women comics creators like Tanya Meyer and others. So I would just sort of throw that out. But all of that said, if you love fantasy and you love sci-fi, this is the list for you.
I mean, just by contrast, if you'll indulge me, last year's nominees for this same category were Super Mutant Magic Academy and Svetlana Chmakova's Awkward and March Book 2 and Oyster War and Drowned City and Moose. And I could read the list off for the year prior to, but it's the same kind of feeling that, it's less of the quote unquote mainstream serialized stories and more standalone graphic novels. And it almost makes me think, maybe that if there is going to be more category expansion from the Eisners, since this market is getting sort of increasing attention and I think the readership is continuing to grow, whether it makes sense to start separating young adult or teen titles by things that are series, like Batgirl, like Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, even something like Bad Machinery, with those things that are sort of individual or standalone works. I wonder if that's one way that you could separate out the many, many entries that you could include in a category like this. But I think it is almost, if you took away the title of the category and just looked at the list of titles and you contrasted this year's list with last year's list, you'd almost think it was a different, you could almost put a different label at the top of what kind of comic it is, right? And the thing that I find sort of interesting about all this is that just at the point where a lot of mainstream children's and young adult publishers are investing a lot of money and time into the YA category, there are no examples of the YA category from those publishers on this list. And so, that I don't know if it's intentional or not. We have no idea what the longer... that is one of the differences between the Eisners and, say, the National Book Award. With the National Book Award, there's a long list. Right. So you have a sense for the books that were taken seriously, that were on the list, and then you see the short list and you understand a bit about what the culling process probably looked like to get it there. Right. Here, we don't know what was turned in and what was submitted. There were a lot of great YA comics this year. I will say that this was a
a year that wasn't as strong probably in the graphic novel category for young adults. Depending upon how you define that category, it was an extremely strong year for the middle grade texts, I would argue. Very strong.
Yeah.
So, I think that probably some of it may just be that there are a lot of texts on the horizon that are about to be published that will fit better into this category, with maybe a sort of philosophical shift that if you're thinking about what teenagers are actually reading in the realm of comics, this list may be more representative than last year's list. I mean, as an example, Moose, which was an amazing comic, and now I'm going to have to look up who wrote it because, as we can see, I can't even remember a book I just read.
No, that's okay. I will take it from the top of my head, and it's Max de Radagais from Conundrum.
Yeah, and so that was a comic that was very high art. In fact, I think Andy and I debated its age designation in general, and had a cautionary discussion about the comic because of some of the sensitive nature of that comic. Right now I'm engaged in a scholarly project where I'm looking at the way that young people are depicted in comics for written primarily for adults versus comics written for young people, and there are really some profound differences. And if you had just given me Moose as a text and that was it, and told me read it and put it somewhere, I would have put it into that former category of a text about a young person written for adults. Yeah. On the other hand, I would argue that every single text on this list is definitely YA. In fact, although maybe Bad Machinery bleeds back over into the middle grade because the characters are dealing with a lot of those things that middle graders comics typically deal with, like friendships in certain ways. But actually, every single one of these comics, I could see a teenager actually reading. So, I don't know. We don't know. And this is why, I think what would be really fun is maybe we can get some Eisner people on a podcast and talk to them about this next year. That would be a lot of fun because,
absolutely.
I always want to be really careful when we start to we have our pet theories about how things happen and why they happen. But it's great to always just talk to the people who actually are doing it. They may have some realities about this that we aren't even considering. So
that's right. That's true. That's right. This is all speculation, especially when it's coming from me. I think from you, it's somebody who's a bit more of an insider in that you're doing research and so forth.
And then I'm chasing down comics creators and making them talk to me like that kid in the
like
other
Mark
book. I
Crilley's
swear, maybe that's why I was so sensitive to it. It's like, oh my God, I'm looking in the mirror. Please tell me what you were thinking.
Me and you both. Isn't that what it means to be a researcher?
But we go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess last thought is just that the two things that are distinguishing a lot of these books from lists in the past, one, I think, being the serialized nature, and two, being the heavy genre representation. When I think about that, and then I think about books for teens in general, I often think of the Newbery winners or whatever, the canonical, assigned in class books. But when you think about what teens are actually reading after Hunger Games, after Harry Potter and so forth, the idea of one, being part of a larger, serialized narrative, and two, belonging to genre, what would previously have been categorized and maybe even dismissed as genre fiction. That's just, I think, much more common. So maybe some of this is also just reflecting what is in the teen market.
Right.
Yeah. So should we then dive into some of the specific titles here?
Shall we dance? Yes.
Shall we?
Go.
We shall.
All right,
so
here we go.
Let's get into Bad Machinery, Volume 5, The Case of the Fire Inside, by John Allison. And Allison's webcomic, Bad Machinery, has been going for a long time, actually, since 2009. And it actually came to a close this last year. I think you're right that it's been more popular in the UK, where Allison is from, but I think it's coming into more prominence because I'm speculating again, but he's writing Giant Days for Boom. And I think more American readers have become more aware of his sense of humor and his storytelling and how great it is. And so, I think seeing him as an artist, the Eisners want to make sure that this really great webcomic that Oni has turned into a book series is getting some Eisner love before it's too late, because the webcomic does end. But we have 6 main characters who are sort of teenage characters, and a world of others in the city around them in the fictional Tackleford, England. And they go to school, and they've dealt with school drama and rich real estate developers and funny ghosts. And, it's a very zany kind of story that has, as a webcomic, a very serialized sense of storytelling, that a bit of the legacy of newspaper comic strips, I think is very much carried on. That torch is carried on now by webcomics. Actually, I had read the first 4 volumes and my daughter and I actually had read the first 4 volumes of Bad Machinery before we found out that this one was nominated. And they're actually out now up through volume 7 collected. So it was great to see The Fire Inside on here. A lot of it went over my daughter's head. Some of it maybe even went over my head. Some of that is the sense of humor, and some of it is maybe the British English and stuff like that. But really, I think the series is very appealing on multiple levels. The characters are funny and distinctive. Situations are sometimes pretty screwball, but sometimes they can also be quite serious. And Allison just has a penchant for quick-witted dialogue, but also can kind of slow down and do these dramatic moments. So, I like Bad Machinery a lot. Just a word about production format. This volume that we're looking at, volume 5, is like volumes 1 to 4 in that they're these huge and wide kind of formats where each page is kind of like a good, widescreen computer screen almost,
I have the exact measurements because I pulled up my measuring tape while I was sitting here.
Right.
They're 12.5 by 9. So,
oh, there you go. And huge. And when they open up, they're also huge. It's like those old, latter day Calvin and Hobbes collections that really try to replicate how glorious and beautiful they looked. But actually I just got volume 7 in the mail order and from our sponsor DCBS, and I'm kind of sad because volume 7 is actually more of a paperback size, and although I can never find a place on my shelf for these Bad Machinery books because they're just the wrong shape and size for the shelf, which I imagine is part of the reason why they're changing the size. I'm a little sad because I like the largeness of those pages. So,
they're beautiful. I mean, the color is wonderful. And it's sort of, when I was reading it, it was sort of like Super Mutant Magic Academy meets Lumberjanes, but then in England.
That's great. Yeah.
And,
great.
because his style has a real Boom-esque feel to it. I agree. Boom Studios feel.
Yep.
But then it's like, I've been thinking a lot about, Super Mutant Magic Academy because I've been writing on it and I taught it recently, and it's like this is the PG version of that, where you get a bunch of kids together at a school. In this case, it's Griswold's Grammar School, and they're a little bit younger than the protagonists in Super Mutant Magic Academy. But then they have these really fascinating things that are happening to them, at least in this volume, and so it's sort of part sort of science fiction. It's part teen angst, and it's a lot of fun. I used to live in England. I have a lot of affinity for the British school scene and for stories like that. And this one definitely brings it into the 21st century. I mean, these kids are definitely contemporary kids. This is not Harry Potter either. Right. At least not the early Christopher Columbus Harry Potter. This is definitely a little more edgy and a lot of fun. I really loved reading it, and I loved the format. So
yes, I think that Allison, both in Giant Days and in Bad Machinery, is just kind of, again, combining a lot of the best of what were, sort of the combination of humor and adventure that was part of the great Sunday comics, and also, making good use of the webcomic format and just very striking a very contemporary, a very modern note. And so big fan of Bad Machinery, and I really do encourage listeners to, seize the opportunity to read not just volume 5, but really the whole run. It's really great.
Absolutely. Well, our next comic is a very traditional kind of comic. DC Comics, a collection of the volumes of Batgirl that have been written by Hope Larson, drawn by Rafael Albuquerque. And essentially, in this particular iteration of Batgirl, she is basically moving over to Japan to train to up her ante with her skill set, as it were. And it turns out that she has a number of combat disciplines that she has to learn on the fly or the run or the however you want to put it. And boy, that was a loud laugh. And I will say that what distinguishes this particular series for me, I've been reading a lot of comic series right now. And first of all, just the pace of action is super fast. And the choice of color here definitely is designed to underscore like the deep anger and emotion that is going on here with these different characters. And it's a beautiful book to look at. It's extremely fast-paced, and it's just so different for me from the work that Hope Larson has done otherwise. I mean, she's best known probably to children's lit people as the author of the comic Chiggers, which was her first graphic novel that I would argue introduced a world that then Raina Tegelmeier came and really found a home in, which is the world of girls' friendships and that sort of focus. And then she did the adaptation, really beautiful adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time, bilingual. And now she's doing this wonderful collaborative series with Rebecca Mock called the 4 Points series. And so it's really been shifting gears for me to then open up a traditional comic book and to read Hope's dialogue in this kind of setting, because this is a very fight heavy comic. It's a lot different than, say, if you're used to Miss Marvel, which has a lot more narrative and a lot more focus on backstory. This is not that kind of comic. This is a very fast-paced, fight heavy comic. And even in the back where you get sort of alternate covers and alternate drawings, it's all about the fighting. So if you love if you love Fight Club, this is the comic for you. It's a focus, I think, on someone kind of trying to figure out who she is. But boy, there's not a lot of time for her to do that because she's so busy kicking the crap out of things or being bought. No. So that was I saw this as I feel almost like I need to take a Motrin after reading this comic because there was so much going on in the way of kicks and ninja stuff and all this other kind of stuff. So
definitely. I guess I like this series again, and I also am a big fan of Hope Larson from her other work, and I do think that this is a bit of a departure. I'm going to put on the hat where I'm a big superhero nerd as well, which I don't get to wear as much.
See, I don't own that hat, so you need to be the one among us that has it on. Right.
I mean, and I think that probably is relevant context, because I feel like you can't judge this book in terms of why the Eisner's judges might appreciate it, if not for some context of Batgirl, namely that, DC had this big relaunch, in, I think, 2011, 2012. That was the New 52. And a lot of it was very traditional superhero fare, as you're, tend to get with DC. But late in that, time period, before this recent DC rebirth thing that they've done, they kind of did a little bit of a reboot of Batgirl, and Batgirl before that had been written by Gail Simone and with art by various people. But I think I'm blanking on the specific issue number. It was something in the 30s or 40s of the previous volume of Batgirl. A new creative team that included Stuart McCarthy and Babs Tarr, who's was at the time a new artist, sort of revived Batgirl and also brought a very different sensibility to it. One that I think you could, in sort of a generous fashion, talk about what you were just referring to, Gwen, when you talked about that Boom Studio style, but a much more sort of contemporary and maybe sort of Tumblr-esque, style. And it was the Batgirl of Burnside, which was this very sort of hipster area of Gotham that they fabricated and created. And a lot of the characters, it just really sort of was a very different mood brought to Batgirl. She had a sort of costume reinvention and stuff like that, and it was very hip. And just the overall sensibility of the book was just a huge departure from the very grim and gritty superhero stuff that was surrounding it. And that, I think, made such a big splash that it was a really interesting question what would follow it once that series ended and once the New 52 was coming to an end. And so when they announced this DC rebirth, they had on the stage a whole bunch of the the usual sort of DC Comics superhero creators on there. And then they announced Batgirl, and they said Hope Larson, and there was almost an audible gasp, from the comics assembled comics press, who were sort of like, wow, one of these is not like the others, But I think that, so there was a question. I mean, I think people assumed, that Larson would be awesome and would bring some really awesome things to the title. And so what she did in a sense, removing Batgirl from that Burnside setting where she had been, not in a way of like, that was terrible, but really just kind of a palate cleanser and exploring the character in a very different way and in a very different place. And just really kind of allowing her to see the world. I think all of that was a bit of the context of why this was a kind of a refreshing story. I mean, it contains ton of, as you said, the sort of fight superhero tropes that you expect. But some of the things about her, about the setting, about what she was exploring, about how she was finding herself. Batgirl is also a really fraught character because there's been a lot of history as far as her depiction and its relation to violence, including sexual violence. In fact, the artist, Rafael Albuquerque, was the artist of a variant cover that was quite controversial because it depicted a scene from the Alan Moore Batman Killing Joke where it just is right. it sort of had that threat of again violence. And I think people didn't sort of blame or attribute that to Albuquerque, and I think his work on this as an artist was a chance to again cleanse the palate, maybe kind of sort of a reset to depict the character with a lot of humanity and a lot of hope and a lot of strength. And I think that was all, that kind of all went into the mix of this little run, which also is just I think pretty satisfying as just a read on its own, even without all of that background and context. But I think with the weight of that background and context, I think that's part of what's being acknowledged in this nomination.
Yeah.
Are we still awake out there?
Yeah, we are.
Paul's had his superhero.
I think that's really helpful to help me understand a little bit more of where it's coming from. I was familiar with some of that, but not all of it. And
right.
I mean, I think I just have to be really careful here because, when you let elements of taste or genre interest interfere with your review, that's not a good thing. So I'm trying not to do that, but I will admit to you that this is not my favorite aspect of comics. And so, but I read it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very zippy. I would say that again, in the sort of time-honored tradition of Gwen fighting stuff, I would say I really liked Delilah Dirk and the King's Shilling probably a little better.
That's a good comparison. Yeah.
And because there you get a lot of really great action, adventure, and fighting and stuff like that, but you also get a backstory that to me was really pretty fascinating. And so, but that said, it's a beautifully drawn comic. It's interesting. It's fun. And for folks who enjoy this, sort of thing a lot more than I do, I'm sure that they were really excited to see this on here. And, Hope Larson is a really good writer. There were lots of, in the midst of this, there's just a lot of really fun dialogue. And so I actually thought it was quite good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. And one last little thing, if I could just sneak this in there, is that a comic, especially one that is as, again, quote unquote mainstream as this is, having an Asian male character who is conflicted and not just sort of a saintly representation of making up for past racism, and also be attractive is so rare for me to see that just this little thanks.
Before we go back to our white male heteronormative Jughead, let's
make a mention of all of that stuff. Yeah.
Oh goodness! In fact, the cover of Jughead couldn't be more sublimely like, I'm ready for my hamburger.
Right. At least it's Jughead. It's that familiar Jughead. So to take us into that, shall we? Into Jughead, which is by Chip Zdarsky, Ryan North, Erica Henderson, and Derek Charm. Although I primarily read the first run, which is written by Chip Zdarsky and drawn by Erica Henderson, but I think it gets carried on from there by the others. But this was part of Archie's reboot, and so Zdarsky, who is of course the writer of a lot of comics like Howard the Duck and now Spectacular Spider-Man, and Erica Henderson, most known probably for Squirrel Girl, and then later Derek Charm, were part of this Archie reboot. And Jughead is this updated rendition that, has a lot of the same core characteristics of the 75-year-old Jughead that's been a classic part of classic Archie. Classic is the descriptor that I'm going to put to all of that. In fact, they actually include classic Jughead strips from Archie in the back of each of these issues, which is kind of fun. It's a cool way to connect this contemporary reboot from with its history. And it has a little bit of Zdarsky commentary on it too. So any thoughts, Gwen, on Jughead?
Well, I will say that it's been hard to keep up with the Riverdale franchise because, the horror comics that came out a couple of years ago, one of my good friends is writing on those. And I was actually at a conference presentation with her where she was talking about them, and they're doing some really interesting social commentary.
Yeah.
But this, but this text is too, in its own way, is really commenting on, those age old questions of adult authority and arbitrary adult authority, but also, it's sort of, I know I'm reading too much into this, but how people have been talking recently that the current, and I don't want to get too political, but the current administration is now being compared to the Bush administration, and people are making this joke, right? That you thought you didn't like George W. Bush, but now how is he? It's like, boy, George W. Bush is feeling really good right now. Well, it's sort of like that. This text sort of begins with that premise, and that you may have had some conflicts with your previous teachers and principals, but look out, because now we've got someone who's come to town who's going to take your hamburgers away. And
I love that the Principal Weatherby George W. Bush analog that's in your comparison.
Well, that was what I thought of immediately. And, and in some ways, I think we have to be really careful here, because whenever an author decides to write about issues of young people engaging in social activism, there are a lot of pitfalls. I mean, a lot of people, when the Harry Potter series came out, criticized J.K. Rowling for diminishing Hermione's activism on behalf of the house elves, and really sort of making fun of her almost. I mean, the idea that a young woman as bright as Hermione Granger would create an organization that had the initial SPEW, SPEW. That in and of itself was felt like a cheap shot. So when I first started reading this, I was just a little bit worried, because in some ways the philanthropy that you see being talked about here, where where many of the sort of young women characters are particularly interested in the environment and in saving it. We're starting to think, okay. And then, Jughead is making fun of them. And then something that he cares about is threatened, and suddenly he becomes this great social activist. And that particular storyline was pretty funny to me. And a lot of this is over the top, but it's very well. First of all, it's extremely well drawn. There are a lot of fun gags. It's extremely topical, and it was a lot. I mean, as a kid, I read Archie a lot, so this is an area where I do feel a little bit more comfort, because this was a comic that I read a lot as a kid, and I too appreciated some of the inclusion of some of the older, although again, not as old as I am, because this thing does go back way, way back. Back when I was a kid, this was one of the major series that I had access to, and I have a lot of fond memories. And this feels, even though it's been rebooted, it's still there's still something about the high school milieu. I mean, you just feel like you're at Riverdale, and so I thought it was very good. And I will say that I thought that the first part was maybe a little bit more cohesive, the first couple issues, and held my attention a little bit more. But again, the cover alone of this comic is just so priceless in capturing the essence of the character who is Jughead that I just have to, like a serious hat tip here, and really enjoyed it. So,
yeah. I think, As far as what you were saying, about the sort of activism of young people and turning that a little bit into a joke, I felt the same way too. I always feel a little bit saddened by that. Actually, one of the things I study is young people's civic engagement, and when civic engagement gets rendered in pop culture as a kind of facile do-goodism, it just kind of bothers me a little bit. But on the other hand, I think that for a generation where cynicism is sort of taken for granted, but in a way that allows us to move past it a lot of times, which I notice about pop culture a lot, targeted at young people. I think that there's, it's sort of a standard tone and approach to be a little bit ironic about all that stuff. And Chip Zdarsky especially knows how to capitalize on that. But ultimately, the narrative does come back to a kind of, earnestness or whatever that makes it okay for me. I gotta say, I agree with you. The art is great. And Erica Henderson is just so good and so witty and so crafty that, and I think it's because of the carryover effect from Squirrel Girl that I've just had so many hearty laughs from Squirrel Girl that just seeing her style it brings a smile to my face. And so I think she brings over a whole lot of cred to that, to this series from what she's done in Squirrel Girl. But just the kind of parody of genres or the rhythm jokes, and punchlines and little visual asides, I just feel like Henderson, brings a whole lot to what is, of course, as you said, a standby, a set of characters and world and stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of a lot of characters and an intense story world.
Monstress, yes.
Yes, Monstress. Wow. Okay, Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda out of Image. Mm-hmm. And this is a incredibly intense, dense fantasy world.
Yes.
That a reader like me, with my interests, is completely unprepared to deal with. I enjoyed it. And I will say that the any comic that has a talking cat, is okay with me. No matter what else is going on, even if I can't find a grounded place or a center, I can identify and relate to the talking cat. So that part was great. But Paul, I'm going to let you talk about this one because I felt kind of I had to struggle to get through it, and I started reading it once, put it down, started reading it again, and this is just like it was a lot was going on,
right? Yeah,
and it's. Yeah.
No,
so
I
Paul,
I totally get you. Yeah. No, and actually I was, maybe one response to that is I was a little surprised that Monstress ended up in this category. Not because I don't love it, but it just never occurred to me as a teen-oriented book, actually. And I guess it makes sense for reasons that I'll explain. But yeah, I know what you mean. It's dense, and I gotta admit, the first issue I think was like a 50 or 60 page first issue, and I picked it up when it first came out. I'm a big fan of Marjorie Liu, and so I was excited about it. I thought the art looked spellbinding, but I also had the same problem of getting through it initially, and I think it's probably fair to say that for many readers there's maybe a high hump of entry, so to speak. But I do think that what's going on here, and part of it was me recognizing my out of touchness a little bit myself, because I think what Liu and Sana Takeda here are doing represents a lot of where youth culture is going. That is just very much a stark contrast to comics of the past, even the other things that are here on this list, to the preceding title, which is obviously very classic. Because I see in this book, there's a lot of layered worlds that are, a kind of, use of fantasy and science fiction that are these examinations of what I've come to understand as very, like, the internalized and externalized impacts of colonialism. right?
Yeah.
Like you can kind of see that in the setup of the world. And there's a lot of elements to this that part of me realizing my unfamiliarity to them is because I didn't grow up reading a lot of manga or watching a lot of anime, right? But I sort of know enough about it to recognize a lot of the signifiers of that stuff. And I think American comics are used to a certain amount of genre bifurcations that help us to place what something is that I think anime and manga is less restrained in a lot of that stuff. And so cute animal stuff can coexist with a lot of like body horror, right? Or you have these deep mythologies that can coexist with these kind of steampunk atmospherics or, very gothic and romantic sensibilities. There's like elements of this that have like these storytelling elements, including a lot of violence. That's part of urban fantasy, but also has a very kind of, rooted and, emotion-based, aspects to it. And so I feel like reading it as a whole, once I kind of got over that initial hump, I was totally hooked and quite absorbed with Monstress. And I think what impresses me is that Takeda and Liu, when they use these different signifiers and tropes of these different kinds of stories, even the faces of the sort of like scary matron characters remind me a lot of anime series. Mm-hmm. They seem to be using them in a way that's not like, oh, I'm capitalizing on something that's popular with young people. But to me, it seems very much like they're storytelling in their quote unquote native language, in terms of like cultural signifiers and things like that. And then creating a very unbridled and really pretty amazing story that explores a lot of complex stuff. And what's exciting to me about this title is, Takeda, but Marjorie Liu, who's done a lot of work at Marvel, and she was a big part of creating the character of Laura Kinney, who's was in that recent Logan movie. Mm-hmm. I think Liu is this great, powerful representative voice, who's kind of declaring like, a lot of times kids who grow up in the States who are fans of otaku culture and who grow up on anime and manga, they still feel like their fandom is a little bit outside of the American mainstream. But I think Liu is doing a lot to say, no, this is mainstream. And oh, by the way, it can be really, really compelling. And so I guess my way of thinking about it is that as a teenager, I remember reading the Lord of the Rings stuff. This was actually before the movies. And the sense that this was a vast world that was kind of an extended metaphor for a lot of things that I thought about as a teenager, spiritual life and things like that. Mm-hmm. But it's really exciting to me that teenagers today have this story as a kind of extended metaphor for the struggle and experiences of, living in the wake of political and cultural imperialism. Right? That there's a kind of like these beautiful sides and these dark sides to cultural hybridity, and just the process of becoming as a young adult conscious of a very antagonistic world that I think this kind of story does a lot to represent and to help young people to process and think about.
The comic that it reminded me the most of, and you might laugh at this, but I had a very similar response to reading The Last Fan. The one by Bastion Vives and Balak.
Love that book. Love that series.
But I mean, there actually, there's a lot of imperialism going on in that comic.
Right. Yeah,
this is like the antithesis of that in many ways. And so but in both instances, I think what paralyzed me a little bit was just, I can handle like the intersection of maybe one or two worlds together, but this is like four, at
I know what
minimum.
You mean. Yeah.
And that was what I think and also just the pressure of time of reading like 15 comics or rereading some of them. This one was just like, oh my God, Paul saved me, because I sort of felt like, okay, I've read this, and I understand what's happening, and I don't mean to be like, difficult. I think that in many ways, it's dealing directly with intersectionality, and especially, I mean, in a really profound way, visually. And that is, I mean, in terms of representation, that actually was what was more interesting to me about this comic than the plot or anything else. When we think about, we can say terms like intersectionality, we can advocate for them even in our politics, but seeing that play out visually here in many ways was really powerful. And so I don't want to in any way denigrate this, because it's an incredibly imaginative and rich text. I think that for someone like me, I would just simply need to go back, take a lot of time, and read it really carefully. And it's true, I don't have a lot of interest in. I have interest in manga. I don't have a lot of experience, and I sort of made a decision a couple of years ago when I realized. I mean, I'm in my 50s. If I were in my 20s, I would have made a very different set of decisions. But you know, at this age, learning Japanese culture, understanding the long history of Japanese comics seems overwhelming to me. And there are a lot of really great scholars in the field who are doing that. Whereas my experience with French literature, French culture, French language just made it much more comfortable for me. So like I can read a comic like The Last Man, and I know where Bastien Vives is coming from. I feel really comfortable in what his contributions are and what he's playing with. And even if it's not as personally interesting to me as, say, some of the topics that are brought up in Monstress. On the other hand, I get the shorthand in ways that you're talking about with that you're getting with this comic. But at any rate, I totally can see why it's on the list. It's a very unbelievably multi-layered and beautifully conceived comic. So
yeah. I mean, and I guess the thoughts that I was trying to open with too is I wonder a little bit about what it says that it is on this list. You know, that it was not put up by the creators or by Image for a different category, or maybe it was, but it winds up nominated in this list, right?
It's the most nominated comic this year.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's just that the other nominations are in categories for specific
for artists
and stuff. So that's why.
Yeah.
But yeah, it actually, so it's whether or not I have been, deeply won over by it. The reality is that clearly the industry has, and so I think you're right, Paul, when you say that this is we're looking a little bit at least one way that the future is going to unfold in comics. And remember too that we're getting a whole readership now of young people who are in their mid to late 20s, who grew up with manga and who are much more comfortable with it, and for whom this is going to be like a super awesome series, and they're going to get the it's interesting too though, because I was thinking a lot about Nameless City, which would be like if this is the high art sort of impressionistic painting, like Nameless City is more of the very rote, but a lot of the same issues are brought up in these comics about sovereignty, about self, about naming, about all of those sorts of issues. Notice that Nameless City doesn't make the cut this year either. And
that's right. That's true.
To me, that's fascinating in and of itself, because I think it's probably a little bit more of an accessible comic, but dealing with some of the same issues. So it's fascinating.
It's really interesting. Yep.
And then we move on to yet another really complicated comic.
Yeah, Trish Trash, Roller Girl of Mars, by Jessica Abel from Paper Cuts and Super Genius. Did you have some thoughts that you wanted to start us off with this, or?
Well, this is taking on this comic. I can see that for some readers, this would be a really exciting comic, because it reminds me a little bit of the way that Lumberjanes has been set out with. Because if you're really familiar with that series, you know that there's a lot of text that comes along with it. In fact, pages and pages of backstory that are conveyed via text. And the same thing is the case with this comic as well, although that backstory and a lot of that information is actually at the back of the text.
Right.
And so, we have this... basically, this is sort of like if you took Roller Girl and mixed it up with like a really sci-fi plot with slightly older characters. It's sort of like Star Wars meets Roller Girl.
Yeah, it's a good.
So sorry, Victoria Jameson, if I've your mind, but it is, because there's the sport here is hover derby, but it's definitely roller derby, and in the same way, and it's about a young woman who, like Luke Skywalker, is trying to find her way in a world that where she feels she's kind of in a backwater situation, and so just maybe to talk about the way that the book looks and you can interact with it is a good place to begin. And so it's a hardcover comic. It's sort of a modified size of a Franco-Belgian comic. So again, another text in this category that sort of physically is pretty imposing. There are about 10 pages in the back that give you a background on a lot of the setting. And this is like, for instance, we're in this is well into the sort of future.
Right.
And so we're in like 2192 or something like that. I mean, so it's far into the future, but you get the reach back into the 21st century that we're currently living in for some of both the way that the sport has evolved, but also the way that the environment on Earth has evolved and the problems that have been wrought by our issues. And then we have Mars as a place that actually has both what are called native Martians, who are non-human beings evolved in Mars, or the indigenous Martians. And then you have native Martians who are humans born on Mars, commonly known as martyrs. And so you have all of this sort of the tropes of colonization told against the backdrop of a story of basic sports competition. And so it's beautiful. You know, Jessica Abel is such a talented artist. She teaches comics, for goodness sake. So you can, all the sort of technical things that make a comic wonderful, including the way that she expresses both very close one-on-one conversations between characters, but also the way that she depicts scenes in which sporting and action are going on. It's really technically awesome. And so, you know, it's a very strong text. I think that it will definitely appeal to a reader who's looking to immerse themselves in a story world. And it's probably a story world that's a little more accessible to the general reader than, say, the story world of Monstress. So that's how I would sort of link the two. It's not that they're dealing with somewhat similar themes, but I think it's just a little bit, it's not only a more accessible world, I think, by design, but that whole glossary section, as I would term it, is definitely there, I think, to help those readers who have trouble. You know, a lot of comics now for young readers begin just right in the scene, you know, and so you as a reader have to kind of catch up and fill in the gaps. And it's almost as if Abel understood that some of her readers might want some help with that. And so that's really where you get the sort of backstory and the sort of context and descriptions that perhaps are better rendered in text and illustration as opposed to in the comics format. So that was sort of my general impression of it.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, I mean, to me, I read this as a very canny move from Abel, a bit of a departure from what she's done in the past, although she's not been easily pinned down or pegged. So I don't know if you can call it a departure, but I think of all the books in this category, this is the one that's least like the others, not in the sense of being serialized, because this is volume 1, and not in the sense of being genre, because this is sci-fi, as you said, but in the sense that just Jessica Abel as a creator is coming from a different place. You know, this isn't a DC or a Marvel or an Image book. It's sort of more graphic novel-esque. And Abel has done in the past La Perdida, which was autobiographical, and with Matt Madden doing the drawing words, writing pictures, and mastering comics books that are about how-to comics. And anybody, I think, who does a great how-to book, you know, knows that they're then putting their own work under a kind of microscope, as Scott McCloud experienced with his work after understanding comics and stuff. So, but Abel's also is actually herself a podcaster, and also has a book called On the Wire about podcasting. So really diverse interests. And what I feel like she's done is really read the market as far as, you know, what young people are looking for, and maybe even the idea that creating comics for young people, you know, with this strong female protagonist, a girl of color, you know, doing the sci-fi thing, doing the sort of hover derby, roller derby thing, is right in the pocket of a lot of where interest lies, you know, where there's a lot of interest. But in doing that, she's also introducing a lot of the expert graphic novel, you know, comics, artist, sort of ingenuity that she has, and makes it really good. And so in what you were saying about this large story world, this large landscape that she's created, it reminds me of things like Finder or Lazarus or Kelly Sue DeConnick and Valentine Delandro's Image book, which I won't say the title, but you know, and it's just these very large and you know, I think it's a teen-friendly version of that kind of world-building landscape that is really kind of, you know, people can kind of get lost in it, but it's not all, you know, vitally necessary to understand the story, as you were saying. Maybe unlike Monstress, where it's just like, if you don't know what's going on in the world, it's really hard to keep up with the story. So, so I was impressed. I think it's a nice, like I said, a little bit something different from what Abel's done in the past, but everything about it makes sense to me. And it's the first volume of, I guess, what's going to be ongoing. I'm not sure how long it's slated to go, but enough that I'm intrigued to keep with it.
And it's an interesting format, though, for a series, because the other texts that we've been talking about so far are paperback. And this is not. And that's the only thing that makes me sort of wonder about how young readers are interacting with it. A lot of times in the U.S., people just aren't as culturally conditioned to look at a slim, long comic as being, and with a hard cover, as being something that you're just going to pick up and throw in your backpack. So it'll be interesting to see whether maybe it's re-released as because I think it would have done just as well as in a paperback format, quite honestly. So it'll be interesting to see if that maintains it too. But there was a little bit, I know in my notes you probably read them through because I sent them to you. I did feel it was a little formulaic. So when you were sort of mentioning that, I kind of felt that was a little bit of a characteristic as well.
I think it's fair.
I have to be very fair and try to remember too that I may be reading this comic from sort of the jaundiced attitude of an adult who's read literally thousands of comics in the last year. But I certainly will say one thing. Abel is so talented as an artist, and her characters, their interactions with each other, you really feel the emotion without a lot of work. I mean, there's, I was talking about how in Batgirl, a lot of the things are expressed through color and through movement because there isn't that much of a script throughout portions of that text. Whereas here, there doesn't really need to be in some ways because Abel is so good at drawing faces and the expressions and things like that. So it you could pick this book up even in the middle of it and really have a clear sense of the feeling and the mood in that world that's been created here. So
yeah, I agree. I think this is an example of excellent cartooning from somebody who not only knows excellent cartooning, but has studied excellent storytelling as exhibited by On the Wire. And so, but I think your critique is fair. I mean, one of the things you suspect about somebody who has done so much teaching and analysis is that it's almost too doctored. You know what I mean? It's like a little bit too much of everything that should be appealing. And so it may feel a little bit formulaic. I think another critique that I might have of it is that, since we're talking about Hover Derby, it's a cool sort of like, I'm sure I'm using this wrong, but like a girl power kind of exercise, but all of the 15 to 17 year olds don't look like 15 to 17 year old bodies, including, I wish there was a wider body type spectrum, in the characters. Yeah. And for a cartoonist who's actually really good at balancing, I think, the spectrum from cartooning to more realistic photographic, I think she's really good at that, but I just wish that included those considerations I just mentioned.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's go to a comic where those aren't the issues.
Yes, Squirrel Girl.
This is our last comic today. It's The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl by Ryan North and Erica Henderson out of Marvel. Basically, this is a story of Doreen Green, who is a person who initially was put forward as a mutant. As part of the larger Marvel universe about that. So folks, just check your hat at the door on that one. Ultimately, she was sort of cast to be distinct from mutant, but she basically has this squirrelish ability. Like she has all the positive aspects of being a squirrel. Plus, she has a sidekick called Tippy Toe. And when saw
who's a squirrel, right?
Who's a squirrel? Sorry, I should have suggested.
No, that's right.
And this is probably one of the funniest comics that I have ever read. When it first came out, I just could not stop laughing. Every single page is funny. In fact, it's sort of like, I would argue, it's sort of like Jillian Tamaki on steroids, I mean, Tamaki's humor is just as prevalent, but it's much more subtle and low-key, whereas Henderson's humor is just all over the place, and it's so funny. So, Paul, I know this is a favorite of yours. I think your daughter really likes this too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, this is gonna sound funny, but I've given Squirrel Girl a lot of thought. I've read it myself. I've read all of it. We have all of the trades. We have all the big hardbacks. We have the young adult novelization that Shannon Hale actually wrote, and I've also read it with my daughter. I've talked about it on my other podcast, which is now called The Comic Syllabus, and I think I've pinned this down.
All right, Paul. Let us know.
I'll let you know. So these are my 3 reasons why this Squirrel Girl might be my favorite comic book.
Okay.
The first is that it's superhero comics, but it's superhero comics that's self-conscious about being superhero comics,
right?
But not in a way that takes itself too seriously in a kind of like Watchmen deconstruction kind of way,
right.
But with irony and with humor, which I think really kind of lets you enjoy being superhero comics while laughing knowingly at all the tropes and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So, comics in America especially are just, in some ways chained to their association with superheroes. And so what do you do with that? I love the brilliant way that it handles that. The second thing is that for me, being a lifelong fan of comic strips, especially ones that were kind of a combination of gags and imagination and characters. So, your Calvin and Hobbes and your Peanuts and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But also somebody who's always loved superhero comics and also loved that, indie comic or alternative underground comics sense of humor and irony. I think Squirrel Girl feels like just like the perfect combination of elements of all those things. It's Ryan North, started out doing webcomics and just has a great sense of humor. Henderson's art, we've already talked about. I think reading it to me as somebody who loves that wide range of comics, I feel like I'm eating really high quality pizza with fresh squeezed lemonade, and kale chips. It's like just the right combination of things that hit home for me. And lastly, I think it's the only comic that I equally enjoy reading by myself and reading with my daughter.
Okay.
I think it's a lot like, my little brother when he was 24 years old and I was as excited to hang out with him as my daughter was, and so it's got that quality. It's just, it's G-rated, but it has these warm fuzzies, but it's also like intelligent and witty as heck. So yeah, I guess overall, I just feel like Squirrel Girl has maybe the best of that, the best of the millennials sensibility, I'd say. Kids who grew up on Jon Stewart, and The Daily Show,
right.
With a sense of humor that's humane and has heart, but it's not afraid to also just kind of like tear down things, periodically. And, but it's never preachy, and just the kind of acceptance between Squirrel Girl and her best friend Nancy and Coy Boy and all these other characters. I guess to sum it up, I'd say if you're going to initiate social change through pop culture, by shaping people's way of thinking and their outlook and their ethic, you could do a lot worse than Squirrel Girl.
Well, and also just in terms of body image, I mean, Squirrel Girl is, she's an average girl. She just,
right.
in both in terms of looks, in terms of weight, height, everything. And there are ways in which that is treated so respectfully here. I just have to say that, in many ways, to me, the 2 comics that have come out in the last couple of years that are really excite me the most for young women are the Lumberjane series and, of course, Noelle Stevenson's work in general, and Erica Henderson and her work here, because really it's getting beyond the self-consciousness of talking about, girls and their relationship issues and all this other kind of stuff, and just getting into some fun action adventure where the major focus is on the heroine or the heroines in terms of Lumberjanes and how they like navigate this crazy world we live in without always having to focus on issues like body image and that sort of stuff. I just love it. And I know that if I had been a young woman when these 2 series came out, I would have been over the moon. So when I saw Unbeatable Squirrel Girl on this list, I was like, yes.
Yeah.
Because this is really, to me, the best of what superhero comics can do.
Yeah.
For me, and again, this is a taste issue, so I'm not making a value judgment. But I really love that. And also just all of the kind of cultural reference that might make as much sense to someone my age. Like, for instance, just the Squirrel Girl song is such a kick into like the past of the campy kind of Batman or, or
the Spider-Man,
or whatever, and so it also is sort of a lot of fun for someone my age to really kind of get into that and enjoy it. So.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
I loved it.
absolutely. I mean, all of the thoughts that I shared was just assuming that other people had read it, but, really on the surface, for people who don't know, it's just a funny, as Gwen was saying, the amount of laugh out louds per page index is just extremely high on this, and including, and as well as its self-referentiality and sort of Squirrel Girl on Twitter and the little, little one sentence jokes that are on the bottom. There's just moments where I have just sort of been uproariously laughing as I'm reading Squirrel Girl.
Well, and it's a lot of the reference to culture I actually understand, so there may be that too. I may be dating myself with that aspect of things because like the squirrel, it's true,
Right?
There's so
Milli
many
Vanilli,
ways
yep.
in which it's just so funny, and you just get the sense, like I really always had the sense that the people working on Ms. Marvel really were enjoying themselves, that they thought that they were doing something that was really important and significant. Well, I get the sense that this group too of comics creators and are just having a lot of fun creating this comic, and that energy comes off of it and really makes it just really is a lot of fun. And I could just see it would be so much fun reading this with a kid,
Absolutely.
and going through it, even though it is in the YA category, and that in and of itself, because there are certain things that start to happen with Squirrel Girl that do get a little bit more mature, for some readers. That's probably why it's here. But again, this is a wacky category this year. That's all I'm going to say. And I guess that in some ways it's exciting that there's so much diversity in terms of format. And I mean, even if you just look at the texts themselves physically, they're all really differently sized and shaped and different publication aesthetics and everything. So it's that part is exciting. What's a little strange is the complete absence of graphic novels, standalone graphic novels. So it will be interesting to see if next year that changes any, but we'll just have to see.
That's a great summary of this category, Gwen. Thanks.
Wow, Paul, this has been a marathon for us. You and I are usually like in, out, we're on our way. And today I'm looking at around 2 hours and 52 minutes since we turned on Audacity. So I hope that our listeners are still with us, and maybe we should put in the show notes, have some soda and get a meal.
That's right.
We'll take you through your meal. So wonderful discussing this with you. And for our listeners who want to pick up these comics and others like them, we want to remind folks to visit our sponsors, DCB Service and their sister company In Stock Trades, where you'll find lots of amazing comics priced at anywhere from 20 to 50% off list price. Now, after you do get those comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you're going to see a tab that reads Send Email. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to contact us the truly old school way, get a squirrel. No. Okay. You can call us on the telephone at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Paul, how can people reach you?
You can find me at paul@comicsalternative.com if you want to email us. And I do hope you do contact us, whether it's through interaction on social media or by email or by SpeakPipe, all these different means that we have. We'd love to get some feedback from you about the Young Readers episodes, our discussion of these Eisner nominees, and whatever you want to interact with us about. You can find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcast and updates to our blog, at 2 Guys with PhDs. That's with the number 2. We're also on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and all those other channels. Podcasting is a thing that you can access through iTunes or Stitcher or TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play Music. We are in all of those places, and happy to serve you as your Young Readers episode hosts.
That's right. Well, you know what, Paul, this has been so much fun. And,
yes, it has.
If folks want to go back and reference any of those episodes that we referenced in our discussion, they can do that at comicsalternative.com. And until next time, wow, I think I need now like a massage and a big meal. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul. And we'll keep reading somehow.